Greetings. I'll start over. I am so honored to be moderating this significant gathering, the Native American Oral History Symposium. I am speaking today from Brooklyn, New York, on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. I honor the Lenape Delaware nations, their elders, past and present, and future generations. I also give respect to the indigenous people from eastern Oklahoma, where I grew up, where Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, and descendants of other nations who were forcibly removed from their traditional territories. This symposium itself has a debt of gratitude to the rich and complex history of Native America. I extend my respect to the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums for all that they are doing to sustain and advance Indigenous cultures, and especially all they do to continue with tribal cultural organizations, tribal leaders, and Native educators, librarians, and artists. From the substantive conferences to partnerships with foundations, federal agencies,
history. Having heard my interview.
John, you're muted.
I don't know how that happens. I'm so sorry, everybody. And also with the significant leadership and generosity is provided from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for the Native Oral History Revitalization Projects. It's such significant and meaningful work and such important source material for scholars and all of us working to advance a deeply informed discourse about the lives of Native people, Native communities, our histories, and our lives. Thank you, Susan Feller. Thank you, ATOM staff and board. And thank you, Doris Duke Foundation's leadership. And thanks to all of you who have gathered with us for what promises to be a lively and beneficial 2 days. It is now my honor, with honor and respect, that I introduce my former boss, Kevin Gover, a citizen of the Pawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, who served as director of NMAI from 2007 until January 2021, and is currently the Undersecretary for Museums and Cultures at the Smithsonian, overseeing the institution's history and art museums, cultural centers, the Archives of American Art, and Smithsonian exhibits and National Collections program. Thank you, Kevin Gover, for all that you do on behalf of Native Americans. And thank you for your work as a member of the ATOM governing board.
Well, thank you, John, for that nice introduction. And I just want to echo John and welcome all of you to this symposium. Thank you for your interest and for attending. We're very pleased that to have such a good turnout. I want to commend the staff of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums for their good work in putting this together. I'd also like to thank the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for their support of this event. We're very grateful. As the Undersecretary for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian, we're very aware of the importance, of course, of history. And for many, many generations, the Native American way of passing on history was to do so by storytelling. And that storytelling is a powerful tradition, and Native people are wonderful storytellers. Now, the Smithsonian is not currently collecting oral histories, at least not systematically, although we do encourage Native American veterans, for example, to share their stories with the Library of Congress, which is collecting the stories of veterans throughout the country. You may note that I have an image behind me of the National Native American Veterans Memorial at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington. And please know that the formal dedication of this memorial, which has been long delayed by COVID, but it will take place on Veterans Day 2022. That's November 11, 2022. And we hope that many of you and your tribal veterans can join us. So with that, I just once again want to thank you all for joining us today. You know the importance of this work. You know what we've inherited from our ancestors. And keep in mind that, that the work that we do now is going to inform many future generations of our people, that with the new technologies, we're able to preserve these stories ever more carefully, ever more accurately. And so what we do today, what we do in these coming years, will redound for generations to the benefit of our descendants. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sam Gill, who is the president and CEO of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and very much the founder of the feast. So, Mr. Gill.
I don't know about that. That's a lot of responsibility, but thank you very much, Kevin, for that introduction. Thank you, John, for kicking us off. Thank you to Susan Fowler and Melissa Brote of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums for their work on the Doris Duke Archive and for bringing us all together. I also want to just thank a few of my colleagues, some of whom are here today. Romelli Bannock from our Child Wellbeing Program has been instrumental in this project. Kristen Ross-Schrafer, our Director of Communications, has been a big part of this effort. And then, although she is no longer with us, she's moved on to a great opportunity at Aspen. Lola Edidokun has been a really instrumental part of this relationship, and I think deserves an enormous amount of credit for helping the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to see this opportunity. And thanks to everybody for taking the time today, for your insight and for your work on these really important ideas, and for really carrying the flame. I'm also coming to you from New York in the historic lands of the Lenape Delaware people. So today, in just hopefully not too long amount of time, I want to discuss a simple idea that I think is really at play here, which is that the idea is this: in knowledge combined with technology, tyranny and oppression always furnish the tools of their own demise. I think one of the more prominent examples of this idea is in the Western world, certainly was the invention of the movable printing press, which is generally believed to have been perfected by Johannes Gutenberg. The Gutenberg Bible was published in 1455. About a half century later, in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the All Souls Catholic Church in Wittenberg, Germany. During Luther's career, publishers in Wittenberg produced nearly 100 works a year, or 3 million total copies of new works, many of them advancing the ideas of the Reformation. Luther offered new knowledge, challenging the established orthodoxy of the Catholic Church and its hold on societies. The printing press arrived as a new technology, quote, just in time, and Europe was forever changed. Catholics could use the printing press too, and they did. So knowledge and technology can be used both by established power and in an insurgency. But the unquestioned supremacy of the Catholic Church, whether you're a Catholic or not, their unquestioned hold over Europe had ended. A new set of ideas now had a claim on people in Europe, on societies in Europe. I think the Doris Duke Archive is also a testament to the potential of knowledge and technology. We don't know a lot about why Doris Duke supported this effort, but we do know something of its scope. The initial program lasted from 1965 to 1972. It supported 7 universities, one slot switched early on, and it now comprises more than 6,000 recordings. Diane Repp, who's with us, who's speaking next, provides very important historical context for this effort in a 2005 article in the Journal of the Southwest that I would encourage you all to read, that I believe was on the 40th anniversary of this effort. A couple things that she points to that really stood out to me. I think one is how much the times matter, that there was a post-war burgeoning in Native American and tribal self-determination as part of an overall civil rights awakening. And that was something that really helped to advance this effort. But a second thing that she points out in this article that struck me was that Philips sold its first portable cassette recorder in 1965, which was a huge asset for oral histories that were being recorded reel to reel. As she notes in the article, you could go out into the field now and actually collect these things instead of bringing someone into your office. So from the very beginning, this project, just by serendipity, benefited from knowledge plus technology. But history does matter. Rep notes that this is the first sort of major emic approach to Native and tribal stories. It's from the perspective of Native Americans and tribal groups. So surely that too is linked to, if not determined by the times. Well, so what was the impact of this effort? This certainly remains one of the most significant records of oral history and oral tradition from these communities. But Susan Penfield, who's also speaking next, in an introduction to that journal, notes the profound impact of this effort on the original participants. In some cases, it accelerated their careers in these fields, and these people remain critical voices of authority to us today, people that we look to and many of us have studied with and from. But even for those who didn't maintain a career studying these cultures, studying their traditions, it changed their lives. Again, knowledge plus technology has the ability to change a life even if it doesn't influence a field. What was not achieved by this project, I think, is an equally important question. Penfield, in her article, notes the scarcity of authoritative literature that has emerged anchored in the archive. That despite this incredible wealth of knowledge and information, there's not necessarily a shelf of books that have emerged from this. It's also been true, and this is obviously something that we've sought to overcome through the most recent iteration of the project led by ATOM, the collections have been difficult to access because they're geographically distributed. You've had to historically physically access them. Rep and Penfield also both acknowledge in their articles that while the project had an express intent to help return these stories and these traditions to Native and tribal communities, this intent has not been consistently and effectively fulfilled. Another risk that has, of course, also emerged with regard to this project is the obsolescence of technology, the inevitable obsolescence of any technology. Reel-to-reel technology is fragile. So, of course, one of the very significant things that happened several years ago when Susan and ATOM came together to bring these universities and to begin considering digitizing these archives is to think about initially, how can we overcome a technological challenge with a new technology? How can we use the affordance of digital technology to preserve, but also to increase the access, to increase the visibility, and to increase the use of this valuable resource? Today, I think, is a moment for us, even though it's just a few years later, to think critically again and differently about the power of knowledge plus technology. Movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too are hard to imagine without the mobile internet. We are in, what is probably the greatest moment of racial reckoning in this country since the 60s, and it exists purely because anyone with a smartphone can record brutality and oppression from the scene. That is what happened in the summer of 2020. I'm not trying to lionize technology. We also just lived through a president who communicated directly with the public in unprecedented ways, often for ill. And we're just over a year removed from a political insurrection that largely grew and metastasized in an online alternative reality that suddenly spilled over into as my younger compatriots say, to in real life. The question we face today is, can we use technology to elevate knowledge and grow knowledge to fight oppression? And in answering this question, I would encourage all of you to consider some other specific questions in your deliberations today. The first is, how can we use technology to make the study and engagement of Native and tribal voices easier? Despite the amazing progress represented in the Doris Duke Archive project to date, it's still easier to book a house in someone's home in another country for your vacation than it is to typically access the kind of knowledge that we're trying to bring to people through this archive. Technology is no longer the barrier. We now have tools in our society that can help us to make these things easier. So the question is, how do we work together to take advantage of that technology and to take advantage of what that technology at a low cost can now achieve that couldn't have been achieved before? A second question is, of course, how do we avoid repeating patterns of oppressive expropriation of culture? I think that one of the things that is really exciting about today's conference is that ATOM obviously is a leader in thinking critically about what meaningful community ownership and determination looks like around archival materials, around historical materials. But it is really vital that we continue this conversation in the concrete rather than further ensconcing the role of a few gatekeepers. And this question is more specific when you're talking about technology. Something that we're seeing through some of these amazing digital tools that are proliferating throughout society is that the biases, often unspoken, of the people programming the tools get encoded into the tools. And so then we take these biases and they also move to scale along with the solution. And so there is more at stake in getting these questions right, even as we look at the amazing power of technology to grow the reach and to grow the visibility and to grow the accessibility of this resource. A third question that I think we should ask through this technology is, how do we accelerate the growth in Native and tribal-led scholarship and research? The original project emerged during a revolution in the academy for Native American history by and for tribal voices, but it was still subject to the limitations of knowledge produced in geographically distributed hierarchical organizations that we call universities. One of the amazing things that technology does, and sort of Silicon Valley technology utopians never tire of reminding us, is it breaks us out of those institutions. That's an opportunity that we can take advantage of. Technology allows us to widen the definition of who is a scholar, to widen the definition of who has the right to use this, to widen the definition of who participates in the constitution of knowledge. But thinking intentionally about what we want to have happen, how we want those definitions to expand, what we want the outcome to be, I think is a huge opportunity afforded to us by this project. Another major question is, how do we use technology to grow our shared repository of Native and tribal oral histories? I think it is amazing that we now have over 6,000 items available online in increasingly accessible ways. But there is no way that we can be satisfied with that. One of our grantees at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation is Storycorps, which, as some of you may know, is a nonprofit that collects American stories and through a partnership with National Public Radio airs them weekly, although you can find them online as well. Since 2003, they've collected more than 500,000 stories. 500,000 stories of individual Americans. We should absolutely have the same level of ambition. To focus purely on the preservation of existing oral histories, I think, is to betray the promise of the original project. And a last question that I would encourage us all to ask is, how do we engage larger publics in the Native American and tribal history and experience? It seems to me that it's just axiomatically true that attaining even a modest vision of justice for Native American and tribal peoples in this country means changing and widening the minds of millions of people around this country. That is long and hard work. You all know it better than I do. But I think that this project can play a key role in that, but only with a wider conception that we constitute together of who we want to reach. So I really hope that you use these days to consider these questions and other important questions that you all are raising. You know, the history of oppression of Native American communities in this country is written in blood. That can't be changed. But I think that that history can be known and understood alongside stories of persistent and irrepressible triumph and progress led by and within these communities. This project joins knowledge that can change the world with technology that is already changing the world. Knowledge plus technology can undermine any oppression. In closing, I return to a thought that Penfield and Rep both use in their articles, which is a quote from Edward Bruner at the 1970 American Oral History Project Directors Conference, saying of the Doris Duke effort, quote, "It's possible that in the next 50 years, the whole character of American Indian life will change completely, and it's not inconceivable that something like this can happen. And these things which we've gathered in this period could have significance beyond which any of us could imagine." I think that you could interpret that quote as a hope for the future or a prognostication about the future. But I prefer to interpret it differently. I prefer to interpret it as a promise. Native American and tribal life will change. It will change for the better. We will be a part of that change if we can preserve and disseminate knowledge through technology so that indeed it can have a significance far beyond the limits of our imaginations. That should be our promise to the future, to create the potential for something that today we cannot possibly imagine. Thank you very much for having this conference. Thank you very much for including me. Congratulations and gratitude for all you do, and I can't wait to see what's discussed for the next couple days. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Sam. That was a wonderful overview, and you brought out some very important questions for us to consider and deliberate about in the coming couple of days. I want you to join me now in welcoming Diana Repp and Susan Penfield, who will give us a history of the Doris Duke collection. Both of these speakers have made extraordinary contributions to the Native oral history and language preservation fields. And of special note, Dr. Repp's dissertation, Inscribing the Raw Materials of History, an analysis of the Doris Duke American Indian Oral History Program, is a must-read for all of us. And Dr. Penfield has been an advocate for language documentation and community-based training for Indigenous languages. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Can you see the screen? Good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Repp,
Thank you for inviting me to present on the history of the Doris Duke American Indian Oral History Program. I am pleased to be presenting with Dr. Susan Penfield. Unfortunately, she could not be here today. So using the technologies that we've been talking about, she and I created a recording that I will share a little bit later in our presentation. I was so pleased to hear this quote, which is one of my favorite quotes. And I'm just going to highlight a little bit more of it. Again,
Yeah.
Can you hear me? No? Okay. Oh, okay. Never mind. I can hear background things. Anyway, this is a quote from Dr. Edward Bruner, who was the director of the program at the University of Illinois. And I'm just going to shorten the quote a little bit. It's possible that in the next 50 years, these things that we've gathered in this period have significance beyond which any of us could imagine. The major funding for the Duke program ended in 1972. It is now 2022. It is indeed 50 years later, and we are looking back and looking forward. The program was initiated late in 1966 in several state universities. You can see them here on the left. The University of California at Los Angeles dropped out after the first year and was eventually replaced by the University of Florida. UCLA hosted the very first directors conference, and we can see what a lot of people were thinking about at the beginning of the program by looking at what the directors said in that conference, as well as another one that took place in 1970. As the directors knew, Miss Doris Duke's philanthropy was generous even in her own time period. According to my calculations from available records, she expended approximately $1,400,000, and in today's 2022 dollars, that is over 12 million. Let's put that in a little bit more perspective. Looking at a 1973 survey of oral history centers, the median of all the respondents was $10,000 to $14,000. Compare that to the Duke grants, where the average was about $40,000 a year. As people were collecting the raw materials of history, they did so with the latest technologies of the time. And thank you for highlighting that earlier. Reel-to-reel recorders, yes, newly invented cassette recorders, which become widely available in the mid-1960s. We can definitely see a parallel, as has been mentioned. In 2022, we can see this with the latest technologies of our times. We have the ability to enhance the program and all the materials in many different ways. And I would add a cautionary observation to this. As I thought over this morning, I added this in. And again, it's already been mentioned a little bit. Thank you very much. A researcher at one of the repositories told me that some of the Duke recordings that they had been made on machines that were now obsolete. And so those recordings were essentially inaccessible at this time. And so please be sure to migrate and update the recordings to the latest formats so that they are accessible. The last thing I'd like to mention on collecting the raw materials of history is that Ms. Duke wanted researchers to gather materials in many different formats, so written documents as well. There were two main goals for the program. The first overall goal was to collect testimony from Indian people, thus gathering the raw material of history from the Indian point of view, again from Dr. Bruner's work. This was based on an appreciation that the Indian point of view was not monolithic or one-dimensional. Part of the reason to have multiple universities was a growing appreciation for the diversity among American Indian peoples as to their cultural perspective and their particular historical experiences. The second goal, as important as the first, was to return copies of the recorded tapes to the tribal communities. This was part of a reciprocal agreement, and it was this approach that this was a joint enterprise between equals. When you look at the 1967 conference, you can see that the directors were looking at areas for further research. Some of these included the history and impact of termination, the Indian Claims Commission, written tribal records, variation within the communities, and building on the recollections of grandchildren of the WPA interviewees. Last on this screen is a quotation about code talkers, not well known in that time period. I wanted to bring this in to acknowledge and honor all the Native peoples who have served in the United States military and in so many other ways. Thank you. Thank you. The directors identified several guiding principles. From the start in 1967, they did not want to generalize. Bernard Fontana, director of the program at the University of Arizona, assumed that 99% of the oral recordings would not be in English. There was an acknowledgement that academia had largely been a white enterprise, and the Duke program had the potential to change that. And they saw that back in 1967. They were trying to be forward-looking. They wanted to collect Native American oral history on how the Native American peoples themselves conceptualized their own past rather than what had been written about them. They wanted to ask Native American leaders what they thought had been neglected. As mentioned earlier, the directors wanted reciprocity between the institutions and communities. The research should produce materials that would be useful to the Native communities themselves. The publication should be widely disseminated, and I would add now that as is culturally appropriate. There was a desire to have a common bibliography, and they saw that in 1967, and by the 1970 director's report, they realized that it was not possible, partly because there were so many different types of topics that were being addressed, and also because they didn't have the technologies available to create a database. The last thing I'd like to mention here is that there was an understanding that graduate students would be conducting some of this research, which brings me to introducing Dr. Susan Penfield. Dr. Penfield's research career began with a grant from the Doris Duke Foundation to work with the Mojave community in Arizona. And this is a photograph of her with Mr. Peter Homer. I am pleased to present Dr. Penfield's recording.
Hi, everyone. I'm here to sort of tell you my story as one of the original Dukies, as we called ourselves. And I will gloss over some of the beginning here to get into maybe perhaps the more what I think are important things. In 1969, I received a grant from Doris Duke as a graduate student. I was actually a graduate student planning to be an old world archaeologist, but I was in a linguistic seminar and someone said, you know, there's these grants available and they will send you out into the field with a native tribe for a summer, and that would be very good experience for an anthropologist, and etc. So I applied for and got a grant which sent me to the reservation I chose, and I had about 12 to choose from. I don't know who guided that effort, but it was the Colorado River Indian Tribes Reservation, which is on the western border of Arizona, and you can see it on the map on the far right of Arizona. There are Mojaves there, there are Hopis, Navajos relocated after the war, and Chemehuevis, who are also indigenous to the area. And so the same summer I went, there was another student who got a Doris Duke grant, Roy Major, who became a professor at Arizona State University sometime later. And we both went off at different times to work in this community. Because I was in linguistics when this was announced, or in a linguistic seminar, the emphasis at Arizona for that particular group at that time was to record native language as much as we could, because there was a recognition that the languages were on the decline. And I will tell you that about that time, Mojave had approximately 1,000 speakers, and you could hear the language everywhere, in the post office, in the market. Today, and I still work with Colorado River Tribes community. Between there and Fort Mojave, which has only Mojave tribe, there might be 5 fluent speakers, 5 native first language fluent speakers. There are groups learning to speak it, which is terrific. But the decline of that language is something I've witnessed in my lifetime, and it's awful. So I'll mention that. Out of that summer, I got a sort of a kernel of data and work that has sustained me for many, many years. I recorded 3 coyote stories, or Faqs stories, they're known in Mojave, that are pretty lengthy. And I did some translation of them, but not transcription until much later. I recorded a lot of hours of oral history in English about various topics, which it ranged for all kinds of things. I'll be talking about those in a minute. And I started a Mojave Lexicon. I didn't go on and do a dictionary because Pamela Monroe from UCLA did a wonderful Mojave dictionary in the late 70s. And that was terrific. But the outcomes, or the tapes that I did that summer have really been used many times over for many different things. And it's really interesting. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about that. There was a requirement that we all understood as Dukies that the materials had to go back to the tribes. Some places that was difficult. So my good friend, Scott Ryerson, who worked in the Seri villages in Mexico, was not able to do that because at the time the Seris only had little huts along the beach. They did not have houses or tribal buildings or anything like that. I don't know the situation now, but there was no place to deposit tapes. In my case, was quite different because, as the picture shows you, even in 1970, there was a tribal library and museum, the first in the state of Arizona, and they had the first tribal archives, to my understanding. So I left a copy of my tapes there when I left, and placed a copy in the Arizona State Museum. I put some restrictions on them. If the speakers asked me to not share them, I didn't, although there was no formal consent in those days, and that has continued to be a sort of a problem. Out of those materials, and this is just my personal story, so I'm sharing that to give you that side of the Doris Duke project. I developed a doctoral dissertation. I went into linguistics instead of archaeology. In 1995, I had a faculty grant from the University of Arizona to work on Mojave conversation, which was fascinating, using the Faqs stories as a basis and having a group of elders listen to them as a group and converse about them in Mojave. Those sessions were recorded. And one of the women, Leona, really took the whole thing to heart. And at one point she said to me, "Can I take one of the tapes home?" And I said, "Well, sure." And so she did. And she came back with a handwritten, I think it's 25 or 30 pages of the tape entirely translated, the Mojave entirely written out. So for her, this was the first time in her life she'd been able to write her native language. And she had just watched me take notes and just got interested and pursued it. And it was really very heartwarming. And she was just so happy that she could do that. I've also used them for seminars, for other students. We made materials, language learning materials out of the brief lexicon I did, and some of the vocabulary that came out of the stories. And just, you can read what else is here that happened to the English versions, really pretty interesting. For me personally, I went in the Doris Duke sort of time doing descriptive linguistics, it's what we called it, and just writing the most you could about the sound and the sentence structure of the language. At some point when technology moved from just recordings to videos, the field of descriptive linguistics got shaped into documentary linguistics, which is a field of its own. And I had, again, really based on the experience that started with the Doris Duke grant, I was asked to be the program director for documenting endangered languages at the National Science Foundation, which I did for 3 years. It was a wonderful experience, put me in touch with many different tribes, and I'm so grateful for all of that.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed Susan's reminiscences at this point in time. I would like to continue on here and just mention quickly 3 things that seemed essential to Susan. She created this slide for us. First, to return to the tribe's any and all materials. She personally wants to know to what extent are native languages represented in the Doris Duke collections. And then the coordination of the projects, recognizing the needs for a common database. Thank you so much for inviting us to present today. Thank you to the University of Arizona Southwest Center for their support in the past. And I echo Dr. Penfield. I am thoroughly enjoying the opportunity to be with all of you and to think about this, and I'm so encouraged by the efforts that are being made. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Diana. Okay.
Great. Hi. Oh, thank you both. That was so substantive, with such reflection and such a history of this program. I so appreciate what Diana and Susan have added to today's conversation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Nguyen from Washington State University, who will discuss some of the content management system and related issues and protocols.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my screen up and shared, and I'll get going. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, the welcome. Again, I'm Michael Nguyen. I'm the Digital Applications Librarian in the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation at Washington State University. And the Washington State University Pullman campus is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu Nez Perce tribe and the Palouse people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, the water, and their ancestors. I also live and work on the territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples in Victoria and Saanich, BC. So in my role providing support for Mukurtu CMS, I've been involved in helping to set up the Archive of Native American Oral History site, supporting the repositories and community creation teams in developing the project workflows. So now I'm excited to take you through a brief overview and demonstration of the core features of the site. So the very first thing that every site visitor will see is this protocols for accessing the collections. This is a general notification to users to inform them of what to expect and what they'll come across and how to use the site. Just briefly, it reads, this site strives to preserve and provide respectful access to the stories of the people represented in the Archive of Native American Oral History. We listen to community members, family, friends, and others about what goes online. Content may be added or taken down at any time. And then there's links to more detailed terms of use and privacy policy. So this message will display on any page when a user first visits the site. So if you send somebody a direct link to a record or to the front page, they will need to click through and accept before they can view the content there. So I'm going to go ahead and click accept, which will take me straight through to the home page from where we can access the rest of the site. Most of the navigation menu items up at the top of the page will direct users to pages with additional resources, contact information, and ways to participate and support the project. I'll visit some of those in a little bit, but the first thing I really want to show today, and frankly, the most exciting portion, is the actual catalog records and recordings that are in the site, and specifically how to find and interact with them. So to get into the catalog, I'm going to click on the Browse Collections link to view the catalog records. So this page, our Browse Collections page, is where we can find and access all of the catalog records in the site. And actually, before I show how to find records and how to navigate more specifically, I want to touch on access, which is, of course, a very important matter. So the majority of the catalog records, which include varying levels of description of each recording, are public. However, most of the recordings themselves, the recordings and the transcripts actually, have yet to be reviewed by community creation teams. So the recordings and transcripts will remain private until they have been reviewed and approved by those community curation teams. Each repository has been working closely with a few pilot communities to test the review workflows and vet material. The community curation teams have been listening to the recordings and reviewing the transcripts for the last few months. At a recent project update, community curation team members shared their excitement in doing the work and also stressed the amount of labor and community engagement involved in doing that work. And it is truly not a quick process. So you can see that while a recording is still under review, a message is displayed to users who do not have permission to access the recordings. When the recording is made public, or if a user with the correct permissions is logged in and looking at the record, they'll see the recording in the transcript instead of the under review message. This particular message reads, this recording is under review and not currently available to the public. If you are a participant or a relative of a participant, please contact us, and then each repository will have their individual contact information listed so you know who to reach out to if you have questions about a given recording that you don't have access to. So with that in mind, we're going to see these messages somewhat across the site as we look today onto true navigation and discovery. Scrolling down the browse page a little bit, I want to draw your attention to the boxes on the right side of the page. From here, we can search, browse, filter, and otherwise refine our results to find the recordings and catalog records that we're interested in. I'll come back and show the search box in action in just a little bit, but below the search box are a series of different filters that we can use to narrow down our results. The first filter that we've got listed here is community or repository. Right now, the majority of the items are coming from repository collections. So if I know that I wanted to search within, say, the collections at the University of Oklahoma or New Mexico, I can select that and narrow down my results, either through searching or browsing. As communities review recordings and contribute materials of their own, they will also be identified and displayed in this field as well. Below the repository filter on the right is the tribe, community, and culture group filter. For the community curation teams and community members, this is likely to be the first filter you're going to want to apply when you're searching. This will show all the records from a given community across each repository, unless you, of course, further refine it by repository, which I just showed. So if you're looking to get a broad sense and actually to get a list of all the recordings related to your community across the entire site, regardless of which repository physically holds them, this is the way to look at that. One other filter that I want to highlight is the category filter. So every record on the site has been assigned one or more categories which represent broad subject areas within the collections as a whole. So if you're interested in recordings about language, activism, community life, or any of the other categories listed here, that's another really valuable way to refine your results. So any combination of those three, if you want to look for materials within one specific community on a given topic, you can apply both of those filters and refine your results down to those specific topics. So earlier, I mentioned that there's a search box at the top of the page. This is a great way to find recordings by a given individual from a specific place on a specific topic or by searching other descriptive terms. Effectively, this is a great way to say, I know I'm looking for something specific and I want to search and see if there's recordings related to that term, to that word, to that concept, to that individual. So when you enter a search term, the system will look across every record within the site that you have access to view. And if that term is somewhere in the record, the title, creator, description summary, keyword, any of the other fields that we use within the site, that item will show up in search results. For example, I know that there's one specific recording that I want to pull up, so I'm going to search for the name Fitzgerald. And when I get my search results, there's one interview that matches that, and that is an interview with Robert Fitzgerald from the Choctaw Nation. So this particular recording has been reviewed by the Choctaw Community Curation Team, and it has been made public. Instead of seeing that under review message that I showed a couple slides ago, you can see here that I can actually preview and listen to the recording right from this landing page, or I can go in and view the full record in more detail. So next, I want to show a couple specific examples to guide us through the catalog records and the recordings. So in this particular case, I was looking for a specific set of items. I know that I wanted to find the Pawnee Nation materials that are held at the University of Oklahoma. So using those sort of search filters that I mentioned earlier, I selected University of Oklahoma and the Pawnee Nation from the relevant fields. And that resulted in, I believe there's 4 items that match the search results. But what I'm interested in is the first record listed here, the Mr. and Mrs. Sam Osborne interview from March 15th of 1968. From these search results, I can of course view the title, I can view a brief summary, preparation and preservation of foods, I can see the repository and the tribe affiliated, and I can view either a preview, in this case it's a preview of the transcript, or it could be a preview of the recording as well. But if I go ahead and click on the title, it will take me into the full record to look at. So across the top we have our title, again, Mr. and Mrs. Sam Osborne interview. Below that there is a media carousel, so that I can move between the transcript and the audio recordings. In this case, this particular record has 1 PDF transcript and 2 audio recordings included. Of course, different records will have different combinations of that. Some will have 1 recording, some may be missing the recording, some may be missing transcripts. It's very item dependent. But in this case, this one has these 3 items that are all bundled up into our single catalog record. Over on the right side, we have information about the record. We can see that the University of Oklahoma is the holding repository. The Pawnee Nation is the represented community in this record. This falls into our oral history and interviews category. We have information about the date it was recorded, the names of the interviewees are listed in the creator field. It's cut off here, but the interviewer would be listed as the contributor. And then we can scroll down and view the rest of the record. Which in this case, most of it was up front at the top of the page there. One thing I can do is if I want to view the entire transcript, in this case, I'm just seeing a preview of the first page here. I can click on the file name of the transcript right below the preview image, and the full transcript will pull up in my browser for easy viewing. In this case, this is a 17-page PDF that is a transcript of both of the recordings represented in that catalog record. Back on the main record page, I've shifted my view over from the PDF transcript to the first of the 2 recordings. Some of the repositories have included images of the physical media. You can see here that we actually have a photo of the original cassette. Right below that is the audio player, and I believe we should be able to listen to a couple moments of the start of the recording.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. This is Ramona Osborne of the American Indian Institute. I'm talking today with my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sam Osborne, both members of the Pawnee tribe, now residing at Pawnee, Oklahoma. The topic of the conversation will deal in the area of some of the foods which were of importance to the Pawnee tribe. And the nature of the conversation will deal around actual experiences that both my mother and my father have had in relation to the planning of various types of food, the preparation and the methods of preserving these foods for future use.
And the recording was a little bit on the quiet side, but the interview continues on from there with Mr. and Mrs. Osborne. So this next example, which is also from the Pawnee Nation, is still under review. So when I took this particular screenshot, I was not logged into the site. I was viewing the record as an anonymous visitor. We can clearly see that there's an under review message with the same kind of details about who to contact and the kind of and the reasons for which it's not available. So I just want to note before going on to show the next slides that I've been given permission to show this record and show a related item. The next screenshots were taken when I was logged in as a user account with the appropriate permissions to view not just our public catalog record, which again, we can see the limited metadata that's available here, but the full recordings and media within the record. So this is the exact same record. Again, I have logged in with the right permissions to view this here. So I can see again that we have a transcript, we have 2 recordings, and these are only visible to me because, again, I have the right permissions. Since this record is under review and does contain sensitive information, I won't be playing the recording or showing the transcript in any more detail than this. But I want to illustrate how different users, especially, again, those who are anonymous visitors, in contrast with community members, will interact with the same record in different ways. But the other big difference here, in addition to viewing the media, is something we haven't seen yet, which is a related item that's displayed over in the top right corner of the page. So using what we call related items is one way to further enrich the collections. In this case, Dr. James Rydingen from the Pawnee Nation uploaded an image of a painting that relates to this, and actually a second recording as well. So this painting, the title of which is Marlene Rydingen's Painting of the Doctor Dance, is a complete item in and of itself, and has been connected to 2 different recordings. So part 1 and 2 of the Grant White interview that I just showed. The dance discussed in those recordings is depicted here by Marlene Rydingen. Again, this particular item is not public, but community members can certainly contribute information, photos, their own documentation to be shared publicly if desired. Going down a little bit further on the same page, on the same record of the painting, we can see that we have our description, which in this case is fairly brief. Marlene Rydingen's painting of the Doctor Dance is based on information provided by Frank Rydingen Sr. She painted the scene in 1941. And over on the right, it's clear that this item was contributed by the Pawnee Nation. It's not affiliated or connected to any of the repositories, and it's only being shared here with members of the community. You can see that there is a protocol specified which says Pawnee Nation community only. This is also further reinforced by the right statement that were provided along with the image, which reads that this item is restricted under the authority of the Pawnee Nation for authorized use in consultation with the Rydingen family. So this is one example of different ways to specify rights, access, and sort of appropriate distribution of records within the site. Again, should community members want to contribute similar items, photos, other supporting information, it's always going to be up to them whether they want to share items publicly or with community members, with family members, however they see fit to share whatever materials they want to contribute. I have one last example to show of our catalog records. This interview is with Nancy Thompson of the Choctaw Nation, and it uses many of the same features that we just saw. I want to show it because it is publicly accessible. It has been reviewed and made publicly accessible, so if you want to go and search for this yourself, you should be able to find it. Again, we have a transcript and a recording and sort of the rest of our familiar catalog record information below that. This also has a related item, which also, again, is public, which is why I wanted to show this one here. So we have a related item, which is a photo of Nancy Thompson, who is featured on that previous recording alongside her step-granddaughter, Elizabeth Thompson. And this particular photo is from the University of Oklahoma collections. This one is not provided directly by a community member. So for the last part of this demonstration, I want to highlight the areas of the site that have to do with other aspects of engagement with the project. So we looked at the Browse Collection section already, but there's a fair bit of other information and resources across the site. So under the About menu, up at the top left, there's links with more information about the project, the repositories, and the communities represented. For example, here I'm looking at the repositories page, which has information about them broadly. And from this page, I can follow links to a landing page for each of the represented repositories. In this case, I'll pull up the University of Florida as an example. And a bit further down on the page, all of the landing pages will include information about the repository. They have provided a list of the communities represented in their Doris Duke collection holdings, and contact information should you want to reach out with more information about their specific materials. So again, if you're looking to research or work directly with one of the repositories, contact them through the information on their individual landing pages is a great way to get started there. There's also a Native Communities page. Here you will find more links to information about the workflows and a list of all of the communities that are represented in the collection. There's also a link to a form to join a community curation team and information on the required supporting documentation to do that. So if your community is already involved in the pilot community curation teams, there may be opportunities to work with them, but obviously as other communities choose to work with a project, they will need to have community curation teams developed as well. And speaking of the community curation teams, I think it'll be valuable to show a fairly high-level overview of the workflow that everybody has been working through. Each of the steps that I'm going to highlight certainly have much more nuance within them, but broadly, the repositories have all been working through to date these first two steps. They've been reviewing their collections, in some cases re-inventorying and describing the items, in many cases digitizing and otherwise processing those materials for work in the site. And then starting with the pilot community curation teams, before moving into all the rest of their communities and their collections, they've been uploading recordings and creating records for all of the items within these holdings. I believe you're going to get some updates from each of the repositories a little bit later today. So this has been ongoing, and some of this work continues to happen as many of these repositories have quite large volumes of collections. Right now, we're mostly working here on step 3. Each community curation team that's been participating so far and all that are assembled going forward receive a spreadsheet with links to their catalog records. So it's easy to access all of the items within the site that are relevant. Those spreadsheets also will contain some basic information about the record. The community curation team members will have user accounts so that they can access the recordings and transcriptions on the site. As they review the materials, as they view the recordings and the transcriptions, they are tracking any immediate feedback they have for the repositories, factual corrections, time-sensitive notes about access, things like that. And they're also recording the decisions that they're making about the appropriate audience for each recording. And ultimately, recordings can either be made publicly accessible, they may need to be retained under review for a longer period of time for other community members to engage, or the recording may need to be shared with a specific audience. This is truly the lion's share of the work that the communities are doing and community curation teams are doing to review this. Once a record has been reviewed and the access decisions and any immediate edits are shared with the project team and the repositories, the record will be updated as agreed on, the community will be properly attributed, and the appropriate protocols will be added or updated. And then finally, once a record has been reviewed and updated, the community will be able to further enrich it as they see fit, whether that's uploading related items, like I showed earlier, creating community records, or more generally sharing, engaging with, and using the materials. So the very last thing that I will highlight here is if you have more questions about how to use the site, there is a Using the Site FAQs document, which is probably the very best place to start, and it's going to answer some of those sort of core questions that I know folks have been having. I'm going to go ahead and actually leave this slide up just for a moment, but that's the end of what I had scheduled. Thank you so much for your time. I believe we're back over to probably Melissa.
Okay, I think John, well, first of all, actually, let's go ahead. Are there any questions that we would like to ask of Michael? I know that we had one question in the chat regarding, let's see. So Michael, is the Archive of Native American Oral History using TK labels to establish access rights permissions for recordings?
That is a fantastic question. Let me just pull up my quick note on that. So in terms of TK labels, none have been integrated into the site at this point. However, they certainly can be in the future. If anybody does want to work with TK labels, they will need to work directly with the local context team to develop those, and then we can certainly support including them into the site. So those are not labels that would be applied directly by the repositories. That would be something that comes from community engagement with them.
Great, thank you. And then this next question, Susan, I think I'll have you answer this. Are members of the community curation teams compensated? If so, who provides the funds?
The members of the pilot communities have been compensated through funds from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Going forward, we're hoping that the project isn't contingent upon people being compensated for their work, but if there is funding available, we will certainly forward it. Sam, did you have a response to that question?
Nope.
Okay, you popped up on my screen. So, and as we go through these questions and answers, if any of our team members have something that you want to contribute or share, either just speak up or raise your hand, and we'll call on you to add additional comments about that. So, John, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yes, and I would encourage some of you are already using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions, Melissa and Susan and I are kind of monitoring that, so we make sure that this is an opportunity for all the questions to be asked. And I appreciate that last question about compensation. I wanted to ask a couple of questions myself. What are the policies that are in effect now for access if there is no content forms from participants in recordings? And who owns the rights of these histories? How will they access, be monitored, and are there copyright issues?
That's a great
That's
question.
a mouthful, isn't it?
It is, and I'm probably going to need some help answering that because the repositories have probably a much better grasp on this subject, but we're taking every recording individually, and some do have permissions and some don't. Different copyright laws apply based on different matters, what's in the recording. And Trevor Reed, who is an attorney, he's Hopi, he's also in the faculty of University of Arizona, will be speaking tomorrow afternoon, and he will be sharing a lot of specifics about the rights to native recordings. So I'm hoping that everybody can be here for that, because you will get a lot more information from him. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay.
Great. Susan, one of the things, and Kevin Gover touched on this a bit in his opening comments, but how is the Smithsonian contributing to the recording of modern Indigenous American cultures? I know there's language preservation efforts at the Smithsonian. Kevin mentioned the Library of Congress and the veterans. What else?
We're in conversations with their new director, Cynthia Chavez Lamar, about how we might be able to forward the Doris Duke collection through various projects with the National Museum of the American Indian. But they have some other big projects in mind. And if anybody is from NMI on the call, and if you want to add to that, you may. Otherwise, we'll move on.
I thought it was fascinating in hearing Michael's presentation, just in the mechanics of how to access the information. We hope that this, all of the repositories will be opportunities for scholars and local Native people and community settings to really go and find sources that inform exhibitions and reading programs in libraries and all sorts of activities. So our imaginations will go wild with all of this. I think, Susan, you had addressed that, yes, indeed, there will be access to the recording for this meeting, so people can follow up and listen a second time if they want. Let me ask you, is the project addressing reparation issues? I mean, there was a reference Michael made to the real community ownership of this, and how are the older descriptions that may have been racist, inappropriate, inaccurate, or simply outdated, how are we going to address that through this project?
Repositories are addressing that in consultation with the community curation teams, because there's some offensive language both in the project or the catalog descriptions as well as the recordings themselves. Some of the recordings depict violence and sensitive topics. And so we're trying to highlight each of those if there is something that people need to be aware of before listening to that particular tape. And we are working with the Society of American Archivists on protocols for new descriptions. It's a national discussion that's going on. So stay tuned.
And Michael, thank you. The sort of layers of technology of who gets to enter and see what and how that's approved at the tribal level and with the community curation. I really appreciate it. I think that's a point that is driven home today. How will Indigenous perspectives and traditional knowledge and community generated narratives and descriptions be incorporated into the repository catalog records and the metadata? I mean, that's a big one too.
Would anyone else like to take that question?
Yes, Michael.
You're on mute, Mike.
Yeah, I can't speak to how the individual repositories are doing it, but within the context of the site, sort of on my technical side, there's two main ways we would see that. The first is the related items example that I showed earlier with Dr. Rydingen's painting that he included. So saying there's an item here that is connected to other materials that I want to share. So they live alongside, they are connected. You can see that there's a relationship between them. The other, which is a tool that I didn't have an example handy to show in the purpose of, or in the context of the site, is community records. So there's an option to add an additional record within each catalog record, so that there's tools there for displaying the catalog or the repository's catalog record alongside a community provided one as well. In terms of how each individual repository will be integrating any of that back into their own collections, that I cannot speak to in detail.
Michael, one of the things I so appreciated about your presentation was how labor intensive all of this is, to especially on the community curation and making sure the protocols are in place. So I know it's time consuming, it's labor intensive, it takes a lot of effort. It seems like people are very much on board. But how can we encourage, let's say, contemporary oral history projects in Native communities, so we're not just stuck in the time frame of this important project, but we're moving into present time? And how do we provide the resources of curation, of preservation of those materials at the community levels as well? Any thoughts on that?
Part of our website has a resource area that's forever growing. So we're trying to provide information on funding and various resources on, for instance, how to do an oral history project and how to get the proper permissions and all of that. So do check out our website as we continue to add resources.
Okay, that's very helpful, Susan. I think one of the issues addressed was if an individual or a tribal representative at any community wants to have access to this, there's a pathway for them doing it. I think part of it is how we promote the availability of this tremendous resource on a national basis, and how it's kind of, if you will, marketed so that community members know, and academics know, scholars at all levels, museum professionals, and so forth. So that's something that's important. Can we submit collections? You know, I know, speaking from a museum background, what about submitting collections, oral history collections from our museums or the tribe to the portal? Is there any procedure, or have we thought through that one yet?
There is a procedure. For now, we're focusing on our flagship collection, which is the Doris Duke Native American Oral History Collection. But we do have the capacity to allow others to enter their collections. And on the site that Michael, or the page that Michael ended with, there is a vehicle there for people who would like to add collections to express interest. And then, you know, we'll enter into individual conversations with those people. And also for individuals, if they want to add something to one of the recordings, on that same page, there is a form where people can express interest in adding materials to the collections.
I think that's also, you know, Susan, one thing that I heard very clearly from Michael's comments is that this is very much a work in progress. There's still different issues to sort through. We're really doing that as a community, and I can't wait to hear from the different repositories on their updates on how some of this work is going. So what is the timetable for involving the tribes in reviewing the materials? What kind of time frame are we looking at here?
We've been working with, I think it's 7 pilot communities, just testing the protocols and trying to get the workflow down. So when we open it up to the 154 remaining communities in the Doris Duke collection, we'll have the procedures down, and it will be easier for everybody to do. I think as soon as the repositories are ready, we're ready. Michael, does that sound about right to you?
I don't see why not. Yep. Yeah, we're the workflows, there's probably 1 or 2 small adjustments to be made, but I think from some of the examples that we've seen that have been approved and shared with the site, that yes, we could certainly look at expanding that out depending on the timeline.
I've seen a few questions popping up about how community curation teams are appointed. They're appointed by tribal leaders, and there is a page on the website that is specific to community involvement. And we've established that protocol because we want to make sure that whoever speaks for the tribe has the authority to speak. And it has to be done in a very methodical way. And so tribal leaders do appoint the communities of the community curation teams. We typically ask that they be people that are, have knowledge of the culture, librarians, museum curators, spiritual leaders. So it's really up to the tribal leader to determine the makeup of those teams. Melissa, were there other comments in or questions about community curation teams?
Let's see. One of the other questions. Sorry, scrolling up.
Oh, you look.
John. Actually, Guha has his hand up. How about we have him? Okay. He has a question. So go ahead, Guha.
Hi. I had a couple of things. One, there was a couple of earlier questions about where TK labels have been implemented in repositories, and the Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center participate and have an ongoing relationship with the Passamaquoddy Nation of Maine to curate historical materials from the 1890s. And I put a couple of links in the chat as to where you might take a look and see the implementation of the traditional knowledge labels. And I think, sort of emphasizing the point that's been made all along by Susan and Melissa and Michael and everybody else, this is a collaborative, co-curated project. So the collection's descriptions and the individual items are being worked on by Passamaquoddy community members who are versed and skilled in the knowledge of their community. That information is then passed on to the repository, the Library of Congress in this case, and surface in the public-facing records that we have at the library. There is, as Michael has mentioned, there's also a parallel site in the Passamaquoddy community itself, which has stood up an instance of Mukurtu CMS to answer another question that's going on that has on the surface already. So the materials are parallel, more or less. There is, of course, a different technical and metadata schema and the layout, which are different, but that's to be expected in any sort of repository view. So that's perhaps one way of thinking about how the traditional knowledge labels are used, how Mukurtu, which is where the platform for the current project is being housed, is worked on at the repository at the tribal community level. So that might give you a different way of looking at it rather than, say, the institutional levels as to how Mukurtu is stood up and used. And so there are other repositories and other communities which are using this. The American Philosophical Society, the Abbey Museum in Maine, I believe, is using one. I'm referring to Mary Downs' chat here. And it has implementations in international context as well. And I don't want to eat up the oxygen in the room, so I will stop talking and say thank you for that opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Guha. So another question, Susan. Someone asked about Mukurtu directly, and as a proprietary software, how sustainable is it, especially for tribal communities, to invest in it? Michael or Susan?
It's free. I mean, that's the best news. But Michael, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I can answer quickly. So it's not proprietary. There's an open source platform. So the source code and options to use it are available to anybody who would like to. There's no licensing or anything directly involved on that side of things. There is certainly cost to implementation, but that'd be the same types of cost to consider as running other large, content-oriented websites. We do have quite a bit more information about the logistical needs and those kinds of things on our FAQs page at mukurtu.org. But we do also provide support training, resources and outreach for anybody looking to work with it. Well, anyone who wants to learn more or potentially use Mukurtu. So in terms of sustainability, this particular platform is using Mukurtu as written. It is not a custom installation of any type at this point. So it's going to continue to receive all of our ongoing development updates, management, and all of that.
We should point out that it was funded initially by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and has support from a wide variety of funders, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. Anybody else that should be mentioned, Michael?
The Mellon Foundation and amongst others as well. Yeah.
Great. Okay, it looks like Alice has her hand up.
Yay.
Yes, I just wanted to just add on the other thing about the Mercatu site and the website. And this was brought up by one of our curation team's members. And it's just to be aware that there are still pockets of reservation communities who do not have access to internet. And although it is prevalent and it seems easy and accessible for everyone, there really still are some places where that's difficult. So I just wanted to have everyone be aware of that, and that in our case, we are working with them. We're already thinking with them what we can do to make those available without that. So it's just another acknowledgement too for the repositories. We all have to remain flexible and to work with whatever is mutually beneficial regarding this project. So just wanted to point that out, that it's not a given for everybody yet. Thanks.
Alice. That's another one of our projects, is to try to improve broadband capacity in Native communities. So hopefully we're working on parallel tracks there.
And actually, just very quickly, I believe there was a like a registration question that somebody had asked about other ways for communities to access the oral histories, and can they receive copies of them for their own collections. And building on what Alice has mentioned, I believe most of the repositories have already been in touch with a number of communities about providing copies directly of the recordings and transcripts. So that is certainly conversations and work that is happening as well. And I believe everybody is doing their best to meet the represented communities where they need to be met on that front.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, it looks like I think we've caught up on all of our questions in the chat. If I missed anything, feel free to pop it back into the chat to make sure I see it. All right, so John, I think you can keep going with the other questions.
Yes.
Comment, if I could.
Oh, Tim, yes.
Before we cut away from it, Michael, I want to give you the highest compliment I can. You are not only brilliant in the knowledge, but the way you communicate that knowledge and the accessibility you allow those of us who are technically, my field is plot, narrative, character, and the wordology of it. But you make your information so accessible to others. And for that, I am highly appreciated. I've gone online on my other computer and been finding things with sites you recommended, and you're a genius. Thank you very much. That's what I mean to say. Thank you.
Hey, Michael.
That was great. Actually, Melissa, I've pretty much covered the questions that I had sort of in my cue cards here, but I think one of the things I'd like to add to the conversation is that ATOM is doing a lot of significant work in other areas, and cross-populating those fields of interest and building a field of Native arts and cultures is very at the heart of this good work. I have to believe, and I'm inspired by the two academics that we heard from earlier today about the dissertation, about the kind of thoughtful, academic work and inquiry that's being done, and that we hope can be shared more broadly at the upcoming ATOM conference in the fall and other meetings that tribal museums have with one another, and so that our field more broadly, I'd encourage every one of the universities to think about how this is, the news is spread throughout the regions and working with other entities. And I think the connections with Humanities Endowment, with the Mellon Foundation, with different funders who, like when Alice brought up that comment about, we're not totally home yet on the accessibility and internet. This is a very big issue, and by our putting those issues on the table, we can hope to find some people to help us solve those challenges.
Thanks, John. I did have. I'm hoping that Dr. Rydingen is present because he has. People have asked me earlier about how the communities are establishing protocols to determine access. And James Rydingen, who is a recently retired professor from the University of Arizona, is working with the Pawnee Nation on protocols for the Pawnee Nation. And I'm hoping that Dr. Rydingen is here and can share some information on that.
I don't think he is.
Okay.
So
that's too bad. Well, if there are no other questions, we can probably go to break. We'll stay on though, in case anybody has questions.
Sure.
Yes.
So, Melissa, we'll reconvene. Anyone stay on board to, for any additional questions, but then we'll reconvene as a group at what, 2:45 Eastern? Is
Yes,
that right?
correct.
Okay, perfect. And then we'll hear from each of the repository. That's great.
Great. All right. See you soon.
We could demonstrate the website a little bit more. There were areas on the website that we didn't review. I don't know if it's important that we do that or
we certainly
people explore on their own.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and post the link to that site again in the chat so people can browse around. And if you have specific questions, we're happy to answer them.
And we do have a Facebook group that we just started today. I think it's got like 2 members so far. But it's gosh, what is it called? There's a link to it on our website. Oh, it's called the Archive of Native American Oral History Facebook group. And we're hoping to be.
You and Melissa are the 2 members, is that right? You
no,
and Melissa
we've got somebody else on there now too.
Okay.
But it will grow.
All right. It looks like we have a question from Veronica.
Hi, everybody. I am a curator and also a researcher. I did my PhD at University of Michigan, and I was very interested in these collections because while I was doing my dissertation, I was forbidden from using oral history in my dissertation. And as a Native person, a tribal member here in Michigan, I was so I was shocked at that, frankly. So when I went on to do other work like curating exhibits and stuff, I was working specifically last summer with the collections at University of Oklahoma, specifically with Cheyenne elders for an exhibit I was working on collaboratively with the Cheyenne Repo Tribe of Oklahoma. And I just wanted to give you the feedback that those subject notations are so incredibly important for people like me, because without them, you just have to basically just go through all the transcripts and just this mountain of beautiful, important information, but you don't always have the time to do that. So just wanted to give you that feedback as somebody who is very much a user of the collection. So thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that we're hoping to do as the project develops is to add a feature called the Oral History Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. I think I left a word out, but that allows you to index it. Is Doug on, Melissa? Would Doug like to address that?
Doug is on.
I am here.
Oh, Doug.
Hey, Doug.
Would you like to talk about OHMs?
Yeah, sure. So we do have the hope that we move into the direction where we use OHMs. When OHMs is a system that basically would enhance access to the interview in the way that you described, that it's a platform that would integrate with MUCR2, and it would, when you sort of OHMs an interview, you basically create a time index where there's a title and a variety of metadata that describes the segment as opposed to just the whole interview. And then what you get there is the ability to just click on a moment, and it takes you to the corresponding moment in the audio and the video. And it also works with transcripts and translation. So if you have a transcript and a translated transcript, those synchronize to the audio and the video as well. And so you create a really tremendous user experience, I think, with that. And so the idea is that will be the next step. Once we get to the first step of digitization, getting things into the portal, getting community approval and review of the content, the next thing will be to really take the step to try and enhance access to the interview itself. And it's a system that's also open source. So the hope is when we kind of bring it together with MOOC2, the idea will be, that everybody can have access to that. And it's really transformed access for us at the Nunn Center. I think we've gone from 200 interviews a year being accessed in the archive to about 200,000 every single year. So the user experience really does matter, and especially hopeful if you can enhance access even in a controlled, curated environment like we will have in the portal. I think that's really going to be exciting to see that happen.
Yeah, that would really be transformative if you could do that. And just one more thing, just as a feedback thing, as you're making these kinds of plans, some things that I went looking for were maybe only mentioned so briefly, where somebody would mention a relative, say. Well, we were doing, I was working with a Cheyenne Arapaho curator, and he and I were curating a show at a museum in Jacksonville, Florida, about the Cheyenne warriors who were imprisoned at Fort Marion down in Florida. And as we were looking for the perspectives of their families and descendants, we would, when I was going through the Duke interviews, to the degree that I had time to, we would see people just mention something really quickly, like, well, my grandfather is whatever, Roman nose. But then they would go on to talk about other things and not really substantively talk about that little piece of information, but knowing that this person in the 30s or excuse me, in the 60s, who was being interviewed was the great granddaughter of Roman nose, could be profoundly important to the community in ways nobody could have anticipated. So even those little bits of information can sometimes be so much more important than anybody would ever even anticipate. So just a little feedback from a researcher, curator.
That's great. Earlier, when you introduced yourself and talked about not being able to use oral histories in your dissertation, I saw Tim Tingle like shaking his head. Tim, are you still on? Would you like to speak to that?
Oops, I'm sorry. Can you say that again, Susan?
Oh, did I cut out? I'm sorry.
Just on me, I probably. So.
Tim Tingle had, when the previous speaker said that oral histories were not acceptable for use in her dissertation, Tim was shaking his head. So I was wondering if he wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, just briefly, the reason I attended University of Oklahoma for grad school in Native American Studies was Dr. Gary Hobson. I was telling stories at a nearby library, had a 2-hour break, wandered across campus, popped in the English department and saw Dr. Gary Hobson, and I picked up a collection of Native American short stories by his at a San Francisco airport not that long ago. And it was Saturday afternoon. I made it down the hall and knocked on the door, and sure enough, he was there. And I told him what I'd been doing for the last several years, almost 10 years. I've been tape recording and recording stories of Choctaws in Mississippi and Texas and Oklahoma. And I had hundreds of hours of those recordings that I had done live and just on a simple little cassette tape recording machine. And he said, well, I had no plans for grad school. He said, well, if you'll agree to come to grad school, we'll give you a full scholarship and enough money for an apartment and food, and we'll pay your way here. I said, are you serious? He said, yes, those recordings are very important. And so I made my way a year later to grad school for a few years, and he insisted that my thesis, he absolutely insisted. And Dr. Hobson is, I'm going to get his tribal affiliation wrong, Cherokee Quapaw, but I think that's right. But he absolutely insisted that my thesis be based on those oral recordings. I had so many other ideas, you know, Choctaw history, this literature and current literature. No, he said, he was very insistent. So Choctaw oral literature became my master's thesis. And these recordings became the basis of that thesis, because there are things in those oral recordings that have never been written, because so many Native peoples, especially the elders, are terrified of telling the truth to other than their family and their tribal members because of things that have happened to their ancestors and to them, for revealing the pain that they've been caused. And when I finished, got my master's degree, I got the degree on a Saturday, and Monday, my first book came out, and it's based on short stories that I wrote that Dr. Helpson helped revise based on those oral recordings. Based on those recordings. So the recordings do make their way into literature and into libraries. It's so very important. And when I hear that the oral recordings are not allowed, that's, thank you for listening. Yuck, okay.
Tim, I appreciate that so much. And I have to tell you, I won't say the person's name because that would be tacky, but it was a Native scholar who someone on my committee who said that, who's quite well known. His dad is very well known. And so I'm hoping, and it really made me change my career. I decided not to go into academia because of that. And there's a basic, as we all know here, basic hypocrisy about it, because what I found in working through many archives on my topic, that they were just as contradictory and subject to opinion and obfuscation, etc. So I just love what you're doing, and it's just going to be such an incredible resource for across Turtle Island. So Chimigwech for your work.
Yeah, okay.
So Susan, looks like we have a couple of questions. I'm going to read this one out loud because I think this will apply to several people. Megan asked, if we represent a community known to be included in the collection as a whole, but have no records in the new site, do we need to contact the repository, or are those records still waiting to be uploaded?
I think we would need more information. I know that there are some records that are not uploaded yet. So it's a work in progress, this website. Which tribe is it?
So this would be Quapaw. No, not Quapaw. Miami.
Miami. Who is at University of Oklahoma?
I do believe.
Okay. Is Lina on? Maybe Lina can address that.
And if not, Megan, what we can do, you can always reach out to us and we can put you in contact with the repository and start that conversation. So I think that would probably be the best way to handle it. Okay, so one of the other questions I think our repositories can answer is when it comes, it's a technical question, when it comes to converting recordings to current formats, what strategies are in use? In-house converting, send out to duplication, conversion specialists, or others? So maybe Janessa or Sam.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Melissa. Yes, this is Janessa from the University of Florida. So we decided to go with a vendor. However, for smaller projects, we have done some things in-house. So it really sort of depends on the scope of the project and any sort of deadlines. But we would be happy to send recommendations for particular vendors to anybody who's interested.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Anybody have anything else they would like to talk about? Or any other questions? Or is everybody taking a break before we get started again?
Did Gu have to on because he had a question about why people would not allow oral narratives.
I think that was more, hi, that was more a rhetorical question, I think, than anything else. I'm still shocked at that notion that somehow oral narratives are not coded as hard history or, sort of factual methodologies or however you want to phrase it. And I think it was answered by somebody else regarding the way in which the discourse about oral histories change. And what you call stories, which were seen as sort of ephemeral, are now oral narratives. And, it's so you have to wait for the shift, I guess, to occur culturally within institutions. But I think the broader point that's being made is there's a certain amount of gatekeeping by academics as to what they consider to be the real stuff as opposed to the fluff and ephemera. So that's it's unfortunate, this little residue. And I think there's a lot of us on this call who work with oral histories, like Dr. Tingle, but also Doug Boyd and Sarah Milligan and others who live with oral narratives and oral history. So I think you just have to find yourself a different community to talk to rather than the ones you know already. We're happy to listen, happy to always talk with like-minded folks. So
I want to thank you for that. And Susan Feller, now, if you would, from now on, if you would refer to me as Dr. Tingle, I do appreciate it. Even though my PhD is somewhere in the clouds of ever afterness. I did get my master's, but not my PhD, but thank you. I'll doctor you anytime you like.
No worries. Thank you, Tim.
All right. Looks like we have a question from Ruth Ann.
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. I'm very interested in cultural mapping and facilitating interactive literal maps that contain stories and linking oral histories to, for instance, grave sites or sacred sites. So I wonder if any of you have experience with how this Mukurtu blends with a mapping tool.
Michael?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. There, at the moment, there is some basic mapping functionality available. It's effectively at this point, you can place one geocoded location per item. It will have the same visibility as the item, but there's options to work with that as well. We are going to be expanding we're going to be expanding the mapping components in the future as well. That's on our sort of, well, we've already developed pieces of that for our next sort of big version update. So we'll have more options to do multi-point and polygons and other bits and pieces there. More, so a little bit right now, definitely option expanding it in the near future. All right.
Thank you. Did I see Nonaball's hand up?
Yeah. Hey guys. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just really, really excited about all of this conversation that's taking place right now. I had to step away from the office and come home at lunchtime to check on my grandson, but it's been really interesting listening to everybody's comments about how a lot of these different conversations are taking place about oral history recordings and some of the what people are finding a little bit more difficult. And I think one of the things that I've realized as one of the community curation team members is that, back in the 60s, it kind of feels like there really was no such thing as appropriation. And that during that time, there was a lot of people who were coming onto reservations being paid to do these recordings. And a lot of these recordings are somewhat very personal. And that's one thing that we've come to realize with a lot of the Navajo recordings that were done, and we haven't gone through all of them because there's so many. But one of the things that I also realized in doing a separate recording project here with our practitioners because of the pandemic and how many traditional practitioners we lost here on Navajo has been, it's been one of those situations where, practitioners are asking us, is this staying within the institution? Where is this going? And having to get them to understand that this is not leaving the institution, that this is going to be a very private and restricted collection for practitioners, for their apprentices, as well as, for our students here within our institution at Dina College. And I think that Cecilia Fire Thunder was asking earlier how some of the tribal colleges can contribute to that. And I think that that's one way, that we can start to do these things, because now, in a sense, we've kind of taken that power back when it comes to doing oral histories and recordings. And I think that that's something that's very important. I know that as I'm getting ready to start and putting together my dissertation proposal, that's one of the things that I'm heavily concentrating on is, looking at story work and including story work in my literature review, because I don't feel like, I've always felt like, aside from being an Indigenous person in the United States, a lot of these oral traditions are what make us the people that we are today. And so using that and reflecting not only on the literature that I've been reading through my doctoral program and that I've gained over the years, it's really important that we start to think about the direction in being able to include some of these oral traditions that are passed down, especially in academic writing. And I think that that's something that's really important when looking at these recordings is, not only the contributions that these individuals have made in the past, but also, looking at what are we doing now to really capture what we need to capture for the future, of our children and our grandchildren. And I think many more times we're hearing, today, I say that, I'm in this new category of young elders because I am a young grandmother, but being able to capture these histories for our children is such an important, aspect of not only my life, but also for their lives in the future. And I think this Doris Duke project really does give us an opportunity to think about, what are some of the new ways or the new technologies that we can use, the new methodologies, especially indigenously, and including indigeneity into our methodologies, and how we capture these oral traditions, I think is really important. So I just wanted to add to that, because I think this is a really, really brilliant conversation, and it's just exciting to hear what everybody's doing and how they're doing things. And, again, thank you, Susan and Melissa and everybody for, helping to contribute to this and helping those of us who are in the pilot really look closely at what is being given back to the tribe. So thank you.
Thank you, Nanaba.
May I make another quick comment? I promise quick. Okay, I appreciate much of what you just said. And depending on the age of your children or your grandchildren, rather than just teaching them the importance of things that have already been recorded from the past, think about 100 years from now, what we will be looked upon. And wouldn't it be wonderful, depending on the age of your grandchildren, if you could give them something for a birthday or Christmas, some kind of recording device that you could teach them how to use, and then you could give them just a few suggestions so they could do an interview with you and teach them how to do that. They would have a great time doing it if it's something they could use, and they could interview you and your past. Because what's going on with us today, 100 years from now, will be history. Okay, that's it.
It's great that you bring that up, because I know, like, as I was working on my thesis, that was one of the advantages I felt that I had, still having a few of my great grandparents around, great aunts and great uncles, who I don't refer to as great aunts and great uncles, but as great grandmas and great grandpas. And, my daughter was fortunate enough that she was able to see great grandparents. And now it's the same way with my grandson. He's there's 5 generations right there, and looking back, our family has really come the full 7 generations. And I think that's what has really got me thinking about, how do we continue to press forward, and how do we start these conversations? Some of us, as tribes, not necessarily all of us have repositories for us to, bring a lot of these items home to. And, a lot of our tribes have a lot of storage units that are not climate control. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to really carefully consider when we're thinking about how do we preserve some of these recordings that are coming back. It's great that they're being digitized now, and I can only imagine how much further things are going to go in the future with all this technology. And as it's improving, it seems like by the day, which is really kind of fascinating. But, it is really, again, fascinating that we're able to do this and that we're able to, really think about, like you said, 25, 50 years down the road, what are our children going to have? What are our grandchildren going to have? And how are they going to be able to interpret these songs and these stories and these prayers that, have been captured over time for them? And I just think it's a really, really beautiful thing that's going on.
Thank you, Nona.
Remember the birthday gift, that little gift to your grandson. Remember that.
Susan, I just have a comment and a suggestion. I so appreciate Nona's comments and contribution to this discussion. And it strikes me that there's some methodologies like that Storycorps developed, and I think Sam Gill made a reference to that in the opening comments. But I'm thinking of like the training opportunities and workshops at ATOM's National Conference, where, even junior level people working in Native libraries and in tribal offices can learn some of the methodologies for actually collecting the stories. And I appreciated that, we've got so many stories and there was so much loss during the last 2.5 years that's going to need to be captured in as storytelling and the lives of the people that have lived through the last 2.5, 3 years, and how we capture that. And I think so I would emphasize the methodologies and sharing that broadly with our colleagues in tribal colleges and other forums and some museums that can help us do this work.
It's an exciting time, and all of these connections will just grow the field and allow us to be much more responsive. So are we on to the repository reports?
Yes, it looks like it is time.
Before we do, thank you everybody for helping with those questions and answers and for your other comments.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to have this last part of the day today, and I'll have some closing comments at the very end. But we'll have these repository reports, but I'd like to first introduce the University of Arizona, and then it'll be kind of a revolving where each of them introduces the next group. So let's start with Arizona.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Tucson, Arizona. My name is Molly Stothrop-Maurer, and I'm Associate Librarian and Archivist at the Arizona State Museum, which is part of the University of Arizona. Founded in 1893, the State Museum is the oldest and largest anthropological museum in the U.S. Southwest. We celebrate the region's 13,000-year human history and have exquisite collections that have been designated national treasures, the pottery, basketry, and photograph collection. The library is a special academic library. We're open to the public 3 days a week. Our collections specialize in archaeology, ethnology, ethnohistory, and material culture, all focused on the U.S. Southwest and Northern Mexico. We have 2,000 linear feet of archival material, and this is part of the archives room where we hold the Doris Duke Native Oral History recordings. We're something of a small department. We have 3 staff in our unit and work closely with the manager of the photograph collections. That's why we've been so pleased and honored to receive funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. That's facilitated our ability to hire 2 staff specific to this project. Alice Sadangi, who's the co-director of this grant-funded project. She's the program coordinator at the American Indian Language Development Institute here at the University of Arizona and brings a wealth of knowledge to the table. Kate Stewart is our project archivist, and she comes with experience from the American Folklife Center, so she's worked with oral histories in the past. Both of them are going to present in this session. Kate's going to give you a background about the specific nature of our collections and the representative groups. And then Alice is going to talk about our relationship building with Native American communities and our established community curation teams. So the Duke collection here, which encompasses 689 interviews with 417 different participants, was led by Bernard Fontana, who was known to everyone simply as Bunny. He was the ethnologist here at the State Museum, and his project really revolved around the use of graduate students from the University of Arizona School of Anthropology to conduct the interviews and recordings. One of the things that is very emblematic of our project is that no permission forms were collected in the initial phases of this project, which has largely led to our collection being restricted for the majority of the past 50 years. Access has been allowed on site only, mainly to the original participants or to family members of the participants. So starting last year, our project has been to digitize the remainder of our audio recordings and to really regain all of the lost institutional memory that has occurred in 50 years, but also through recent staff changes. We've vastly improved the organization and description of the collection, and we've contributed contents to the project platform. And we've also begun working with the originating Native communities who, moving forward, will make all decisions regarding any use of the recordings. You can reach us at lark@arizona.edu, or you can reach me at stothart@arizona.edu. And next up, we're going to have Kate Stewart. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Kate Stewart. I'm the project archivist at the Arizona State Museum. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our collection at the Arizona State Museum and what I've been working on since I was hired last March, and also what my student worker Brooke Blizzard has been working on since she was hired in August. We have 615 recordings at the Arizona State Museum. These were all, most of them were done on 5-inch reels, some were on cassette and 7-inch reels. They were all copied to 7-inch reels as duplicates and also onto cassettes. They are now all digitized. When the project first started, we did have some of them digitized. The Tohono O'odham recordings were done as a separate project. We have 274 interview transcripts. These don't necessarily correspond to the tapes. Some interviews are very short and not a full tape, and some interviews are several tapes long. And some of them are bound, some of them are in folders like these. We got a new scanner to work on scanning them, and my student worker Brooke has scanned all of them. We still have about 383 tapes that need to be transcribed, and about 180 that are in Indigenous languages that are also going to need to be translated as well as transcribed. So these are the tribes, communities, and cultural groups in our collections. You can see that our largest group is the Tohono O'odham Nation. We've been working with them as our pilot community. The next largest group is the San Carlos Apache. We also have several other Apache tribes represented in our collection. as well as several different Pueblo tribes in northern New Mexico. And you can see this is a map of where our recordings were done. We do have a few outliers, like in Alaska and Minnesota. We had a conference that was recorded there. But for the vast majority of ours were done in Southwest, and in particular in Arizona, Mexico, and New Mexico. And the cataloging has been a big part of our project. You can see this is the original catalog on the left, this paper-bound catalog done in 1987. And here's a page from it. Very bare bones description of just who the person was, who the interviewer was, the tribe, the date. We don't always have the date, the place, although we don't always have the exact place, and a few sort of keywords or subject headings, but that's not always included either in this. So we're doing a lot of work going through and listening to the recordings to verify that, you know, what the catalog says is correct, and writing summaries if the recording is in English. As you can see on the right, in this case, here's a recording that had 8 interviews on it. They're all pretty short ones. And so since we had the capability to do this in Mukurtu and with digital files, to split up this tape into separate interviews on the audio file and also in Mukurtu, we created new catalog records for each interview. Plus there's also a corresponding translation recording for this on another tape. So we split that one up too, so that we could match the interview and the translation recording along with the transcript together on one Mukurtu record. And now our community curation team, they can log into Mukurtu, listen to that together, rather than having to jump back and forth on those different recordings. So that's a lot of what we're doing as we go through these. Here's some of the topics that we have. You can see they're not all just oral histories and traditional stories. We have a lot of things like music, recordings of meetings and conferences. We just put up the recordings of the directors of all of the Duke Project when they met in 1970. So we have quite a lot of interesting recordings in our project. And as we're going through, we're revising a lot of those older keywords from the old catalog. Some of them are pretty outdated. Looking at how can we use more accurate terms in our catalog today. So if you'd like to get in touch, my name is Kate Stewart again, and you can email me at kvstewart@arizona.edu if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
My name is Alice Sadangi, and I'm going to share with you the tribal outreach activities that we're doing at the Arizona State Museum as part of the Native American Oral History Revitalization Project. But before I do that, I wanted to share that the team at the Arizona State Museum, called Molly, Kate, myself, and Brooke, our graduate student, we all approach this work with great respect and reverence because we recognize that these recordings are very important to tribal communities. And we're aware that we are essentially working with the voices of the ancestors from the living communities that we are collaborating with. So whether the recording is of like a high school graduation or tribal council meeting or traditional knowledge, songs, ceremonial or social, it doesn't matter. They're all important and they're all worthy of respect because they're voices of people who are no longer with us. And we recognize that significance and we acknowledge their continued presence with us through these recordings. So as Kate mentioned, there are 33 tribes represented in the collection, and this map, this visual here, it just shows you how many there are. Many of them all clustered together. And one of our challenges in this project is to try to connect with all of these tribes to share information about the project and to start the process of returning the recordings to them. But one big challenge that was out of our control was the pandemic. And that really limited our ability to travel and to actually sit down and talk with tribes about this project. And we recognize the challenges that tribes still are under with the pandemic. We respect the suffering, we respect the losses and the grief, basically, that have really hit Native American communities hard. And so we respect that, and we know that at some point we will be able to make contact with all of the tribes, and we look forward to that. In the meantime, we have tried to do as much as we can virtually, but as I said, we hope to continue to meet in person. So the Southwest Native Nations Advisory Board is a project of the Arizona State Museum, and this board has been around for a while, and it was our intention to start with them first to share information about the project. And we did that, but then, like the other repositories, we had decided to focus on one tribal community to kind of serve as a pilot as we figured out the processes of how to move forward. And ideally, what we learned, we can apply to other tribes as we move ahead. And the tribe that we've been working with is the Tohono O'odham Nation Language Center, which is housed at the Tohono O'odham Community College. And our main contact there is Ron Geronimo. He's the co-director of the center, and the other director is Leslie Luna. But we worked primarily with Ron based on his interest and experience with the Tohono O'odham Nation recordings, because Ron is responsible for having previously digitized the Tohono O'odham recordings, so he was aware of the information that they contained. So the Language Center is driving the project, and as you know, the purpose of this project is to rely on the guidance of tribal communities in determining what to do with the recordings, who can listen to them, what level of access should be provided. And the Language Center is driving the work, and they've come up with these priorities, which is basically centered on the language, and it's to listen to recordings in the language by fluent speakers to determine sensitivity and access, seek permission from family members, transcribe language recordings, and verify language translations. And to that end, Ron asked us if we could get him some help in figuring out the best practices for transcription work, because he anticipates that at some point they're going to be doing that. And so we were pleased to bring in Doug Boyd who's the director of the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. And the two-day workshop in January was an opportunity for participants to actually have a hands-on experience with Express Scribe, which is a software for transcription. They learned a little bit more from Doug about what the purpose of a style guide is, what can go in it, how should they treat language transcriptions. And one of the recordings that we used for a sample for this workshop, with permission from the Language Center, was a recording that contained both a version in the language and then a translation in English. And there was a real lively discussion among the fluent speakers of the Tohono O'odham Nation there about word usage and meaning. And it became apparent that the Language Center has the opportunity to create a new kind of style guide that could reflect Tohono O'odham sensitivities and sensibilities, attitudes, and culture that are embedded in the language. And so ideally, other tribes will also remember to use their culture, have their culture drive the kind of work that's done. And I just wanted to share a few photos from the workshop here. And this is Leslie Luna, who's the other co-director in the project at the Language Center. And in closing, I just wanted to share that I have had a chance to work with Ron, regularly meet with Ron and the curation team. And we're very fortunate that we can do that. And we actually worked with them to clean up some of the metadata on the web portal. And in doing so, we were reminded again that these recordings and the metadata itself is just not it's not just an information system. at least not to the Tan Atam team, because the information contained is really about the people and their voices, our voices. And so the information is not objective, but rather evokes the presence of individuals who, in many cases, they're no longer part of this physical world. So it's this perspective that really puts this project into a totally different category. There's great potential for tribes to rethink how they do style guides, to rethink oral history, to rethink transcriptions and information systems that are truly Indigenous driven. So I look forward to continued work with the Don Autumn Nation Language Center and other tribes as we navigate this new and exciting project. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you for listening to our talk. Next up, we're going to hear from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bye.
So thank you so much to ATOM and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for having us and for hosting this workshop. To start, we would like to recognize and acknowledge that the University of Illinois is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward to the next 150 years. So thank you all so much again, and we are really honored to be part of this workshop. My name is Bethany Anderson, and I am the Natural and Applied Sciences Archivist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I am joined today by my colleague, Courtney Richardson, who is the Graduate Research Assistant for our project. And among the attendees are team members Jenny Davis and Chris Prom. I will now turn things over to Courtney, who will introduce herself and talk about the communities and materials that we are working with. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Bethany. Again, my name is Courtney. I am a fourth-year doctoral student at the iSchool here at UIUC. And as Bethany said, I'm the graduate research assistant for this portion of the project. And so we want to start with giving you a quick overview of what the materials actually include. So the materials were created, as we know, by Indigenous communities between in our collection between the years of 1966 and 1969. They consist primarily of audiovisual and print and paper-based materials. And so as far as the audiovisual, we have about 90 tapes, which incorporate oral histories and music recordings. And then for the print and paper-based materials, this covers correspondence, microfilmed and photocopied documents, news clippings, publications, field notes and diaries, photographs, maps, and transcriptions. And also the size of this collection is about 50 boxes or 16 cubic feet. And then moving on to the Native communities that we've identified so far, there's 37 nations identified as we're looking over and reviewing the materials. And so as we work more with the Native communities and with the materials that we have digitized, we'll be able to find out more about who is represented and who created the materials more specifically. Listed here on this slide, you'll see 24 nations, tribes, and bands that we've identified so far in specifically the AV materials. And so I'll pass it back to Bethany to talk about the history of the project.
Thanks, Courtney. So I just want to provide some brief background on the materials and the user policy that the archives had in place prior to the current project. The original project, as Courtney mentioned, started in 1966 and was led by Edward Bruner, who was professor in the anthropology department at the University of Illinois. Following the completion of the original Doris Duke project in 1969, the materials were held by the anthropology department. And then in 2002, the department formed the Doris Duke Archives Committee, which comprised several faculty in anthropology and in the history departments. And at that time, the committee reached out to the University of Illinois Archives to inquire about the possibility of transferring the Doris Duke materials to the archives for their stewardship. And at that time, there were a lot of questions about how to best make the materials available, especially in light of the sensitive content of the collection. The access policy that the archives developed came out of conversations with the anthropology department and was informed by the American Anthropological Association's ethics guidelines. The archives also reached out to all of the original field workers to find out more about their original work to inform the access policy for the materials. There were 3 levels of restrictions that were developed at that time. Materials that could be made openly available, which included, for example, project reports and published papers. Materials that required permission by the university archivist was sort of the second level, which included materials such as interview tapes and transcriptions and field notes. And then the sort of third level of restrictions were for materials that required permission from the original field workers. And those included any items that the field worker had specifically identified and requested be restricted. A sunset clause was also included in the access policy to make all of the materials open by January 1st of 2020. And it was very timely because also in early of 2020, the University of Illinois Archives was contacted by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and ATOM about the current project that we are all engaged in today. So just to briefly mention who's on the project team at the University of Illinois. So the project members include myself, Jenny Davis, who is anthropology professor and director of the American Indian Studies program, Chris Prom, who is associate dean for digital strategies, our former graduate assistant, Sarah Carmen, who graduated from the School of Information Sciences earlier this year, Courtney Richardson, who is our current graduate assistant and doctoral student in the School of Information Sciences here at Illinois, Sophia Ebel, who is our undergraduate student assistant, Christina Kuhn, who is the University of Illinois Library's media preservation specialist, Sarah Harris, a colleague of mine in the archives who also manages our digital preservation workflow, and Tricia Lamprin and Stephanie Luke, who are metadata librarians in the University of Illinois Library. So I will now turn it over to Courtney, who's going to talk a bit about our current work.
Okay, thank you. So what we're working on now has been primarily relationship building and working on the Mercatoo website. And so in regard to relationship building, this involves us reaching out to the tribes to discuss the project. And so far, we've been collaborating with the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone tribes in our community curation pilot project, where we call, the community members community curators, because they're actually the ones that's curating the material and helping us with descriptions and things of that nature. And then we're also always in the background researching the tribes that are represented in the collection to have a holistic understanding of all Native communities who created the materials. And then in regard to information processing, as mentioned earlier, we just finished digitizing the audiovisual material and uploaded that to Mercatoo with metadata for review by the tribes. And also we're reprocessing the materials and preparing metadata for access in Mercatoo. And that's it for current work so far.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. So a lot of our work is still ongoing, and we are in the process of reviewing materials also for sensitivities, including offensive and traumatic content, so that we can alert Native communities that we're working with on the project to this content and develop a process for reviewing and determining what of the paper materials would be good candidates to have digitized. And then also to think about what access protocols we would need to have in place for those materials as well. We are also in discussions about developing content warnings as needed, and are in the process of continuing to reach out to Native communities that are represented in the materials to discuss the project and to build relationships around these materials. We're really honored to be working on this project with our Indigenous colleagues and really appreciate the opportunity to talk about where we are with the project. So thank you very much for your time, and we will now turn it over to the University of Florida. Thank you.
I'm still muted. Is everyone able to see my presentation? Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to present today. So my name is Janessa Mahar, and I serve as the anthropology librarian and liaison to the American Indian Indigenous Studies program here at the University of Florida. And I'm also the PI on the revitalization efforts of the Doris Duke collection here at the University of Florida as well. And I'd like to begin just by acknowledging that the University of Florida Gainesville campus is on the ancestral lands of the Seminole and the Patano people who were related to the Timucua culture on the eastern coast. So we acknowledge here at the libraries and from the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program our continuing obligation to make sure that we respect and honor the culture and heritage of not only the ancestral populations and current populations of Florida Native American Indigenous peoples and populations, but also the future of those communities. So thank you. So today, I'm just going to give you all a brief review of our project so far, what we've been up to. And so starting with the collection itself. Slides. There we go. Okay. So the collection is actually curated by two different units at the University of Florida. So we have the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, which actually was named for Dr. Proctor, who was one of the first was one of the people from the University of Florida who received the initial funding from Doris Duke herself. And he started our first oral history program here at UF, and then eventually that program was renamed after him. And the program still collects oral histories to this day. And they've got an ongoing relationship with a couple of different Native American tribes that are represented in our collections. So the University of Florida are part of the co-curation of this collection. We assist SPOP with the curatorial and archival needs of the collection, as well as providing electronic and digital access to materials via the internet. And so we've got our platform called the University of Florida Digital Collections, where many of the transcripts can be found there. So together our two units sort of co-curate and collaborate on revitalizing this collection. So just a brief background to the collection that we're working on. We're actually the easternmost repository out of these 7 represented that received this funding. And so our collection reflects a lot of Eastern-based Native American tribes and nations. We have 6 tribes and nations that represent the larger share of the collection. And that's the Catawba Nation, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, as well as the Urban Lumbee, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, the Porch Band of Creek Indians, the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And in smaller amounts, we've got a few interviews from the Choctaw, Oklahoma Creek, and the Virginia Rappahannock. Currently, when we first assessed the collection, we had about 900 interviews But as we've been going through the materials, we're at over 1,000 interviews and growing, as we have come across sort of hidden interviews or interviews that weren't afforded the necessary metadata to make them discoverable. So the Doris Duke collection specifically represents about 90% of the Native American oral history collection here at UF. Subsequently, after the Doris Duke funding wrapped up in about 1975 here at the University of Florida, there were efforts to acquire funding to go back to those initial tribes and re-interview. So for example, the Seminole Tribe of Florida collection is quite robust, and that there are many interviews from the initial series of fundings, and then there was additional funding applied to go back to visit the Seminole again in the 1990s. So until recently, the collection at UF depended upon travel to the University of Florida to actually access the collection. The majority of it was not digitized. And so to listen to the audio recordings, which were on audio cassette tapes, or to read the transcripts, you would have to travel to UF. So this particular project here for us was about digitization, trying to get the materials digitized so that we could be able to create better access to the collection. So the person of the primary contact for accessing materials at UF has been Deborah Hendricks, and she's the Digital Humanities Project Coordinator at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. So either writing into her, and then occasionally she, was able to, digitize materials at the request of, family members or tribal representatives if they were interested in accessing those materials. But by and large, a catalog has not been made available online and still has not yet. As we're going through the project, we'll be doing that as well. So variously, the interviews that are represented in our collection were either conducted by Samuel Proctor himself, his graduate students at the University of Florida, and in some instances, the interviews were conducted by community members themselves. So I'm just going to give everyone a quick overview of the current project and what we're doing to revitalize this collection. So the primary thing, the first part of our project was to begin to create an electronic database. Again, a catalog had not existed for the collection, and so an electronic database was the best way for us to create a spot where we could expand upon metadata and as well as have the collection become more searchable and sortable. So we triangulated between a number of different archival resources to create this database. Project logs and catalog cards from the initial project. The audio tape inventory was also helpful to fill in some gaps. We used the some metadata that was on the University of Florida digital collections, as well as while we go through the interviews, we are able to add additional metadata and information to the database from the interviews themselves. So you can see two images here. We've got that top image is just a screen capture from one of the records or some of the records from the Mississippi Choctaw, where they actually had their local high school magazine did much of the interviews that are represented in that collection. And then you can see that same, one of those same records, the University of Florida digital collection record of that, of one of these interviews as well. Okay. So while we were creating the database, the electronic database, we also started to digitize the collection. So this was a question that came up earlier about whether we did the digitization in-house or whether we had it vended. We decided on vending. So what we did is most of the interviews within the collection had 2 copies. And so there was a copy, 2 copies of each tape, as it were. And so we sent off 1 copy of every interview to a vendor called Preserve South. And we've worked with them before on similar projects. And so we've got returned audio files, MP3 files, all of the audio tapes. And we started to receive those back in batches. As we received the audio files, Deborah Hendricks and her students at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program performed what they call an audio optimization process on all of the materials. And so that is a process where 3 different software platforms are used to merge track, drop background noise or static, cleaning up voices. Largely, this is to facilitate the retranscription process, but it also makes the listening, much easier. Sometimes the microphones were held at a distance, and so the speaker sounds very far away, or there's something distracting in the background. So the optimization really helps to clarify the audio. And it really hasn't been an essential step for us. And that's because our project largely focuses on the retranscription of these materials. So we decided very early, when we were applying for the funding, to focus on retranscription for our project, as this was really a successful thing to do for many of the other older collections that we have at the University of Florida. In rare cases, we do find that perhaps earlier transcriptionists had some sort of bias or preconceived notions about what the speaker was saying that maybe resulted in an inaccurate or a partial transcript as opposed to a full transcript. So what we're trying to do is retranscribe the interviews to make sure that we get the most accurate rendition of the interview as possible, staying as true as we possibly can to the speaker's intention. And so you can see 2 different examples here of a record that, or of an interview that we know is able to be shown, and it is publicly accessible. The earlier transcriptions, even the finalized versions, you can see that there are hand-drawn edits. And as we know, OCR text recognizing handwriting can be very difficult. There are certain AI programs that will help you to do that, but very few that actually work with typed words and handwritten text. So this way we are creating a born digital copy of the interview as well that will be much more accurate, won't have these wingdings associated with the handwritten corrections, but also will be searchable and also creates a material and information that is more discoverable should these particular interviews be decided to have public access. So during our transcription process, we are going through and correcting inaccuracies, not only in the transcriptions themselves, but any metadata. So working on the proper dates and names of people associated and places associated. We're also working with our community partners on potential transcription. So some interviews we do have that are recorded in an Indigenous language, some of which have been translated and some of them have not. We also have notes within the collection whether the material was to be transcribed or not, depending on the wishes of the tribe. And so we're going through and working with our community partners to make sure that we identify any interviews with Indigenous languages, even entire interviews or just sections of interviews, so they can help us decide how they would like to move forward with that, and if translation is also something that they're interested in. In addition to the transcription and potential translation, we're also adding keywords and subject headings to the materials. And I should note also content warnings as well, as was mentioned by the University of Illinois previously. Content warnings for this collection, by and large, there's derogatory language or occasionally sensitive material that could be harmful to listeners, and so we're trying to work with our community partners on coming up with practices that ensure that any sensitive materials are flagged before they're reviewed by our community partners. And we're working with Michael and the rest of the repository on these subject headings and keywords as well to make sure that materials or headings and subject terms used throughout the collection hopefully will be consistent throughout the collection to facilitate searchability and access throughout the entire collection. Okay. Another thing that we're working on is a review of the rights, permissions, and terms of use with our community partners. As was pointed out by the University of Arizona, similar to our collection, very few of our materials have. There are some sub-collections that have, 90% of the interviews do have a permission form, and then other collections where there are no permission forms. We also do have variations in terms of whether it was signed by the interviewer, interviewee, or a third party, or potentially was not signed at all. So there's a lot of variation in terms of the types of permissions that we've been finding in the archives related to this collection. But the reason why we're going through and reviewing these is we want to look at both the ethical and legal approaches to rights. So even without a signed form, we're working with a signed form, we're still working with our community partners very closely to determine which interviews they would prefer to have open or closed access, or if they would need more time and information to review. And so we're really, relying upon their insight and input and their comfortability when it comes to the most appropriate access for their collection. And finally, digital sharing and repatriation. So in terms of our collection here at UF and with our community partners, we are working with them on their preferences in terms of sharing or repatriation. It really does vary from community to community. By and large, most of our community partners have shown interest in electronic materials. And so we're working on, making sure that we've got digital copies of everything in the collection, whether it's archival material, the earlier transcriptions, our born digital transcriptions, project logs. Unfortunately, we have very few photos, but we do have a lot of supporting materials with the collection. So we'll be sharing those electronically with whatever, whatever file format works best for our community partners. And that has stretched from hard drives to Mugato, of course, different forms of cloud sharing. And eventually when, the physical materials, if they're interested in those, we'll get into archival boxes and things like that as well. Another thing that we've been investigating is the possibility for co-curation and co-ownership of materials. So in cases where the University of Florida does maintain some sort of rights over or very explicit rights over the recordings, we're looking to try to share those rights directly with the community. So they will also co-own and have autonomy or more autonomy over those collections as well. So as far as our current status, you can see here we've got a couple of things that are complete, but of course, as my colleagues Alice and others have pointed out, we remain flexible and we're always sort of updating and upgrading our process when it comes to this project. And by and large, our relationships with our community partners, we hope are going to continue for some time. So even beyond, the bounds of this current grant funding. So the database, even though it's been completed, will continuously be updated as we learn and correct more information. The digitization of audio files has been completed. And so that's more of a check mark is done. Our audio optimization is also completed this time. We're currently working on retranscription, rights and permissions, and of course, all of the practices and protocols for sharing, for responsible and ethical sharing of these materials and repatriation of the materials to their originating communities. And so it's been a real joy working with all of our partner communities and wonderful and interesting to see how they vary in what their needs are, what their requests are. But by and large, across the board, everyone's been very excited about this project and about learning, about these particular interviews and accessing these materials. So I just wanted to say thank you to our community partners. It's been wonderful getting to know you, your colleagues, and working with you on these collections over the last couple months, if not longer. I'm looking forward to maintaining those relationships and working with you further on this project. And I'd also like to thank our project team. Again, thank you to the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for the additional funding to make this possible. We've got colleagues at the libraries and over at SPOP that are working on this on these materials, but we also have a number of student assistants that have been just able to get a wonderful experience, either learning the transcription process, helping to create databases, reviewing archival materials, learning to optimize audio, and so much else. And so you're really helping to provide excellent opportunities to our students here at UF, as well as our community partners. So thank you again to Doris Duke and to ATOM for organizing not only this session, but for the larger project as well. And with that, I will turn it over to, I believe, the University of New Mexico. Thank you, everyone.
Yase, she Jolene Manis Inishia, Todich Eating Nishler, Sensakani Bashish Chin, Umahai Dashiche Do, Salagi Edashinale, Chinli Dat Nasha, Akot Ego Sanan Nishler. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jolene Desbamenis. I am Dene, I am Omaha, and I am Salagi. I am from Chinle, Arizona, which is on the Navajo Reservation. And I am the curator of Native American collections at the University of New Mexico Libraries, and I work in the Center for Southwest Research and Special Collections. Yay, I get to have some. There we go. Okay. The Doris Duke collection at the University of New Mexico is titled the American Indian Oral History Collection. The collection at the University of New Mexico contains over 700 recorded tapes and transcripts of interviews from various indigenous nations, with most recordings in this collection from Southwest tribes. The interviews were conducted by the History and Anthropology departments of UNM, led by Dr. Donald Cutter Sr. between the years 1967 and 1972. The original reel-to-reel audio tapes and transcripts have since been digitized, and they were available previous to this project, both on-site and through New Mexico Digital Collections, but have since been retracted because this project encourages us to get some review before access. So we are working in that way. The majority of the oral history recordings in the American Indian Oral History Collection are from members of the Navajo Nation, with a total of 342 interviews. Recordings from Dene tribal members include noted political and cultural leaders, such as Peter McDonald, who is a formal tribal chairman, Annie Wanika, who was also part of the Navajo Nation Council. She's an educator. Justine Nez and Manuelito Bigay, who are also their noted Hatathlis or medicine men for the Navajo Nation, and lots of individuals sharing important knowledge and matters. Also included are recordings of chapter meetings, council meetings, educational meetings conducted on the Navajo Nation. Dene individuals provide recounts of cultural stories, Dene history with the United States, boarding school experiences, daily life with livestock and farming, public work programs, and health-related topics. There are several interviews spoken in Dene only, with limited translation to English. The Pueblo recordings are vast with information, as all of the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico are represented in the collection, totaling 293 interviews. Knowledge of important aspects of Pueblo life include culture and history of these respective communities shared by distinguished members of the Pueblo nations. Interviewees provided personal and family accounts on their societies, agriculture and farming practices, economy, and government. Also included are spoken intricacies of linguistics of the Caris, Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, and Zuni languages, the original languages of New Mexico. The majority of the interviews from the Pueblo in this collection come from the Pueblo of Isleta and the Pueblo of Laguna. This collection also includes interviews provided by Indigenous individuals from outside of the Southwest region. And as you can see from this list, it's really extensive. And as with the Navajo series and the Pueblo series, some of the collected works are spoken in Indigenous languages with limited translation into English. And so I find this part of the project to be, excuse me, very challenging as I go through and I use the tools to limit, to language. That's where I can go in and I can listen and concentrate. So, I went straight in and I could see that there are interviews that, for the first one on the list here is for the Blackfeet Nation. And so, that's going to, for me to start to plan, it's like, well, okay, I'm going to have to make some contacts. And it's going to be for a lot of places that are not from and around the Southwest. We're going to have to do some outreach. And so I put 48 plus tribal nations on here because we also have a category that includes intertribal and miscellaneous, which pretty much means that, the interview included more than one person from various indigenous nations. The University of New Mexico Libraries, with funding from the Doris Duke Foundation and a project implemented by ATALM, began a collaboration with the Navajo Nation to digitally repatriate the Navajo Oral History series in the American Indian Oral History Collection. These digital heritage items were uploaded to the collaborative platform Mukurtu. UNM Libraries' Doris Duke team decided to approach the Navajo Nation because the largest number of recordings are from Diné. I'm going to look at this for a minute, and I just want to talk about our curation team. We have identified, with the assistance of ATALM, a few individuals to be on our curation team, and that includes Rhiannon Sorrell. She is a Diné College librarian. Nana Bassam, who spoke earlier, she is the Diné College Museum curator, and Ben Sorrell from the Navajo Nation Museum. And I really have to commend the interaction that I feel really fortunate to be able to have with this curation team. So in this project, there's a couple of really important steps that I'm involved in, and that's the contact with the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo Nation is very large. You can look on the maps and you can see how extensive it is. It extends across states, and it runs, across the whole top of Arizona. And so, in initiating a project with the Navajo Nation and in contacting the Navajo Nation president, Jonathan Nez, I always have to keep in mind, and I want to, in communicating with them, that, for us, he's our leader, and he's our leader through this time of a hardship, which, like Alice, she had mentioned, COVID really affected and affects the Navajo Nation daily. And so to extend to the Navajo Nation president that, we have a project happening, it's in motion, in my mind, I have to keep thinking, well, our leaders have to deal with the health of the community on a daily basis. That's the priority. And so it's been very challenging to make a connection. Also, with the team started to go through and, they have permissions to go in and start to look at, we have some virtual meetings to discuss the process. How are we going to do this? And so they started to listen, and we come back and, we have our virtual team meetings, and they are very informative about a lot of things about the original project, and a lot of questions come out from it. So with the team, we are very much in a review process of just even noticing and taking note of how long it takes to review just one oral history. Some of the oral histories, some of the audio recordings are lengthy. You know, I think the longest is about 3 hours. And so that's cut into several audio bites. And so, you know, we have to also be mindful, as previous institutions have noted, is, you know, the time it takes and also the connection on the reservation. And, you know, in looking about how are we going to plan further for bringing in other community curation team members, I did see a question on the chat that asks, you know, what are some of the characteristics that, you know, we would like in looking for more team members, you know, what is it that we need? And so we're making note of some of those things. And so for us, it does include that, you know, we need some community curation team members that speak Diné and also have some knowledge of the storytelling. And also in that with the team, you know, the recognition that even with this team, there's possibly a need to do some further outreach, and we have to be very specific about when we want to do a further outreach to those that might know more than what we know, you know, but we have to be careful about, you know, the time that it takes for that person, for the outreach. So the where we are at with this is that, you know, we are still in the informing the Navajo Nation about this project, and there's another governing body to this that was overlooked a little bit for me, and that's the Navajo Nation Council. And so with the assistance of Nana Bassam and with her chapter president, Sherilyn Yazzie, she was able to help us to get a meeting with the Navajo Nation, Speaker of the Navajo Nation, Seth Damon. And so when you go into a meeting like this, it's not just Seth Damon, you know, it's others in the legislative committee, and they're very interested in knowing what are on these oral histories. We want to hear about them. When you say a name, you know, like Justine Nez, and you have some practitioners that are sitting with us listening, they want to hear, well, what does this medicine man have to say? And so it's far reaching, you know, it's far reaching. They want to know about it. And so to enter into an MOU, it's not just, oh, hey, this is nice, we're going to go ahead and sign it. And it's not like that. So we are in preparation for, you know, their review team, their legislative review, to look at the MOU, to provide their input. They are, you know, they're very clear. They understand that they said it in the meeting that we had with the Navajo Nation Council. So this means that, you know, the materials are still going to remain at UNM, but we are in charge of their access. And that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And so we want to make sure that we honor that, you know, it's going to go on an individual kind of basis where they say, yes, this oral history is okay. Yes, this one is public. This one we're not sure about. And so, you know, at UNM, we're going to need to go into, you know, our finding guides and, you know, note it, you know, this is restricted. And, you know, it's not impossible or, you know, anything like that. I just really want to emphasize that I respect everyone involved that has been involved in this project so far. And especially, you know, those that I work with at UNM. You know, these materials have been at the Center for Southwest Research for this entire time. There have been finding guides that have been created for this that are available through New Mexico Archives Online. and that, you know, as a whole, the University of New Mexico Libraries is in support of, you know, figuring out. I appreciate this project because what this project does is that it encourages the universities to make an outreach to the tribes. That's what that, to me, when I'm communicating to the Navajo Nation, to me, that's the overall goal. That's one of the overall goals. And then the end outcome that, you know, I'm communicating is that digital repatriation means that they tell us, they are the ones that tell us. And so I really feel it is a respectful project. That is, it's a start. Listening to the other institutions talk about some of the initiatives that they are putting forth, just like the University of Florida, to discuss things like co-ownership and co-sharing, because some of the words that we have to use in libraries and archives include ownership, copyright, you know, and those, when you look at a deed of gift, you know, those are some kind of semi-cringy words in some ways that we have to present. And so I think it's important in this project for us to really, you know, dig deep on what is the meaning of this, you know, in a lot of broad ways, you know, for our libraries, and then, you know, for the relationship, and also to expect that the tribes are going to come and they are going to say, these are ours. That's what they're going to say. And so I'm, you know, my presentation is very brief. I just want to really acknowledge, you know, the people that have been involved. And so our project archivist, her name was Rachel Sullivan. And so she did all of the digitization and the uploading. And so for UNM, most of the materials were already digitized. And that's why, you know, I think as far as the digitization and all of the materials that we have, they are all uploaded onto the Mercatu platform. And so we are at the review stage in our project. And also I wanted to note the individuals that work in the Center for Southwest Research and Special Collections, the other archivists and the faculty that work there. And so I just want to say thank you. And I'm turning it over to the University of Oklahoma.
Minwikishaki Nakanic. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lina Ortega, and I'm the Associate Curator at the Western History Collections at the University of Oklahoma Libraries. Is everyone seeing the slide okay? Okay, all right. The Western History Collections is one of the special collections at OU Libraries, and it has a focus on the American West. And the collection has existed for getting close to 100 years now. And it was always a collecting priority by the founding curator and all the subsequent curators to seek out materials that were either by Native Americans or were very much about them. And so because of that, we have really strong holdings on Native Americans in the Western History Collections, especially for the tribes that are currently headquartered here in Oklahoma. So the Doris Duke collection of American Indian oral histories has been preserved in the Western History Collections for decades now. And I see this project, as does the university libraries, as a way to model sort of co-stewardship moving forward, because as I said, we do have a lot of Native American materials here, and we have a lot of work to do to work with the tribes to ensure respectful access to materials that they created or are about them. At the University of Oklahoma, the project was the project to collect oral histories starting in 1967, running through 1972, was administered by the American Indian Institute here on campus. And the Institute still exists, but it has a much more narrow focus than it used to have. When it was administering the Doris Duke oral histories, it was sort of a new institute on campus. And it was run by Native staff or staff who had spent many decades of their career working with tribes here in Oklahoma. So they had a lot of really long-lasting and important connections to Indian country in Oklahoma. The interviews represent almost all of the tribes here in the state, and I'll have a list later on that has them. And many of the interviews were conducted by Native students here on campus at the time, or it might have been staff from the American Indian Institute. And so it's not always the case. Sometimes there were strangers who were doing the interviews, but sometimes it's the case that children or grandchildren or other relatives of the interviewees were the ones running the interview. And so I think that sense of intimacy and cultural knowledge comes across sometimes. The collection here at OU is on almost 1,000 tapes representing almost 700 interviews. The transcripts were created as part of the original Doris Duke funding. And in working with the transcripts, there's a lot of variation in the quality of how they were done. And as some of my counterparts at the other repositories have noted, there are some inaccuracies in doing the transcripts. And I wish that I would have made that a priority to go ahead and just redo them. But the transcripts as they stand now were one of the very early digitization projects of the OU libraries, and they've been accessible through the digital collections online, freely accessible to anyone since 2006. And I can tell you, they are one of the most frequently heavily used collections that we have, with over 5,000 unique hits every year consistently. And they're used by individuals, by tribal communities, by scholarly researchers, whether they be undergraduate students or faculty. And they're used by production companies, and they're used by people who are developing curriculum. And so we get all sorts of inquiries. Our website that provides access to the transcript enables full text searching across the transcripts. And so lots of times people are searching for a specific individual's name or tribe, and of course they're able to do that. But I think as a academic resource, one of the ways that this collection is really important is being able to search across for major themes. And so some of those themes might have to do with school experiences, whether they're boarding schools or public schools. Some of them might have to do with food or agriculture. And then some other topics might have to do with law and order or law enforcement, like the light horsemen that many of the tribal nations had in the 19th century and in fact still have. So it's a very powerful resource. The content included in the interviews really varies. And that's why it is such an incredible research resource. You probably can't really see the names on these tapes distinctly, but one of them is with a man who was a Seminole freedman. So you might know that some of the 5 tribes, what are referred to as the 5 tribes now, like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Muskogee Creek, and the Chickasaw, some of them formerly had slaves. And so a freedman is a formerly enslaved individual of one of those tribes, or they might be descended from a freedman. And so I think it's really important that some of their voices are heard in this collection as well. one of these other tapes is with a Sac and Fox individual named George Harris, and he's talking about the use of peyote in the Sac and Fox tribe here in Oklahoma. And then another recording is with a Kiowa individual who actually did multiple interviews, and he's talking about some of his school experiences. And so when the interviews were conducted, the interviewer, I think, had questions in mind that they wanted to ask, but they also let things kind of unfold as people wanted to talk about them. And they were not just very rigidly scripted. And I think that's why the collection is so extremely valuable now. It's because it really does represent Native individuals' own life experiences and their own discussion of them. The recordings, I have approximately 30 tribes listed here, but sometimes it can be a little hard to map how an individual is identified in a given interview against a list of federally or state recognized tribes here in Oklahoma now. And so sometimes it's pretty straightforward, sometimes it's not. An example of that might be where an interview is designated as Delaware. There's more than one Delaware tribe headquartered in Oklahoma now. Likewise, with the Shawnee tribes, there are 3 headquartered in Oklahoma, and we don't always necessarily know who's represented in that interview. And then some of the tribal towns that are currently federally recognized or state recognized might have been listed as Muskogee Creek when these interviews were being conducted 50 years ago. And so I think as work with all these tribal communities unfolds, they will be helping us a lot to identify how they want an interview described now. You can see that there's quite a bit of variation in how many interviews might represent a given tribe. There are some communities that have many, many interviews. The Cherokee Nation, for example, has hundreds. And then there are other tribes where there might only be a handful of interviews. But I would imagine that, for example, the Seneca Cayuga may not have that many interviews, but most of them are recordings of language classes that were held 50 years ago. So I would imagine that those would be extremely valuable to them now. And I should have mentioned earlier that a lot of the tapes are oral history interviews, but a lot of them are also recordings of events, whether that might be a language class, or it might be a tribal council or a powwow, all sorts of different events. There's even one that's a memorial service conducted during a funeral. As the other repositories have done, I've started out here at OU with a pilot project. And I wanted to go ahead and do a pilot project with 3 tribes who did not have a whole lot of interviews representing their nations. And I wanted to do more than one pilot just because there's such a diversity among the tribal nations here in Oklahoma. And I just wanted to have a little bit different experience. And I'd really like to acknowledge the community curation teams and the staff members from the tribal nations who have been coordinating them, from the Choctaw Nation, the Comanche Nation, and the Pawnee Nation. They have all been very gracious as we initiated this project, and had a lot of patience with me as I've had to work out some of our university processes, and also in developing our memoranda of understanding. And then also as we continue to work on reviewing the transcripts or reviewing the audio recordings, comparing them across the existing transcripts, and then also coming up with some keyword descriptions to help make the recordings a little bit more findable or discoverable. So I really appreciate the graciousness of the 3 tribes that I've worked with so far on this. So the process, as some others have mentioned, has been to initially approach tribal governmental leaders and then work with the staff or the teams that they designate. And then we do have funding available through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation grant to compensate the tribal nations. It's not a 100% compensation by any means, but still to offer some funds to them for their work as they archive the recordings in their own repositories, their own archives, or whatever they want to do with them. And then hopefully this also helps them compensate the community curation teams that they're working with. And also if they want to provide programming as they continue to work with a collection. Oftentimes they have to collaborate with their, excuse me, with their nation's language programs. And then our main work for the project is to work with the tribal nations to ensure respectful access moving forward. So there are interviews that potentially have ceremonial, sacred, or at the very least private information. And so how do they want that access to be moving forward? And then also to improve descriptions. Sometimes it might be something simple, but very important, like we have an individual's name spelled incorrectly, or they might be able to add some other descriptive terms. And then as some of the other repositories have mentioned, originally I thought that I would be able to travel to the different tribes quite a bit and work with them in person a little more closely. And because of pandemic concerns, most tribes are extremely protective, especially of their elders and their children. And so haven't been able to do all of the in-person visits, but I hope that there can be some in the future. So I did see a question in the chat for the University of Oklahoma. So far, the only records I have loaded in there are for the 3 pilot communities. The others, I think, will be added as work commences with each tribal community. And so more materials will be added as we go along. And then I want to acknowledge the work of a graduate assistant for the project, Rebecca Ridge. The main thing that she's working on is to identify photos that we might have of people who were interviewed or are mentioned, or even some of the things like the different churches or the schools that are described in the interviews. And so she's been working very hard to identify photographs that we can also add to the Mukadu site to make them related content to a particular interview. I don't have a complete grasp on to the extent to which different languages are represented in the recordings, but I do know that the languages that are listed are represented in some volume. I didn't especially list some of the tribes where they might only have just a handful of words like how to count 1 to 10 or something like that. But as we continue to work with each tribal community in fleshing out the metadata for each interview, that would be an important thing to add, is if language is represented. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to put in a plug for an on-campus workshop that's going to be this Friday here on the Norman campus at OU. And it's to introduce the project to the OU community. We're fortunate to have a lot of Native American students and faculty and staff on campus. And so the workshop is to be sure that they know about the project, and if they want to assist with different aspects of it, that they have the opportunity to do so, to know that they're welcome in that. And so thank you for your attention. I feel it as a big privilege to be able to work on this project. It's extremely important work. And I do see it as a way to move forward in co-stewarding all of our Native American collections, although that work will take time given the volume and the complexities of it. So thank you. I hope this has been helpful.
Okay, and then next up we have University of South Dakota.
Thank you. Let's see here. Let's see, I know, I think Gavin Spotted Tail and Maya Red Horse have the presentation. Oh, there we go. Okay, so thanks, Gavin and Maya. Okay. Okay, so my name is Sam Hurley. I'm the curator for the South Dakota Oral History Center at University of South Dakota. And I just wanted to say thanks again to Doris Duke and Atom and all the work you've all done so far in coordinating this and inviting us to be a part of the project. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our team members, Dan Daly, Dean of Libraries here, Dr. Elise Boxer, AJ Franken, Damon Leadercharge, Kat Enderberg, Anna Simonson, John Little, and then Maya Red Horse and Gavin Spotted Tail, who are our two graduate assistants who are going to be leading the presentation here in a moment. And then I also wanted to give a shout out also thanks to Tao Ducheneau of Lakota College, who I think was on the call today. And she has just given us tremendous support, input, insight, and assistance over the last year and a half. So to kind of echo in this introduction here, to echo what others have said, we've really made it our priority to go about this project with a firm understanding of its importance and with the greatest respect and care possible in handling these interviews and recordings for all of the reasons that so many others have mentioned already. What's currently up on the USD Mukadu page is really just a small sampling. I know Kat Anderberg, our digital projects director at the Oral History Center, I think uploaded more than 800 interviews and recordings on Mukadu, but what we have up publicly right now is kind of just a handful that are related to the Rosebud Reservation community in South Dakota. And so those are really meant to just kind of give a display of us putting our best foot forward with these materials and understanding the relationships involved, the sensitivities, and so forth. So, to give a further introduction to the Oral History Center here, University of South Dakota, through a branch that's known as the South Dakota Oral History Center, it has more than 1,500 oral histories and recordings that we consider to be Doris Duke oral histories. They're sometimes locally known as the American Indian Research Project, but there's a little bit of variation between those two terms and what they mean here on campus, but generally there's some overlap there. And the bulk of these, of the Duke interviews here, were recorded between 1967 and 1975, similar to the other institutions. A number were deposited up through 2007. These feature, we think, the last estimate that I'm aware of that we did in our assessment. These interviews feature, I think, over 200, of those 1,500 recordings, about 230 or so feature Native American language. About 75% of those are Lakota. I'd say about 20% are Dakota language, and then the rest are about a dozen or so other tribes. The majority of the collection was digitized in MP3 audio and PDF transcripts by the year 2014, but working to improve those where possible in terms of remastering and retranscription is an ongoing project, as other institutions have noted. So it's a large collection, and there are more than 50 tribes. I think probably maybe even upward of 60 tribes represented in the collection somewhere. Mostly, I would say, Western United States or Western North America tribes, Comanche, Apache, Crow, Alaska Nations, Chippewa. But the majority do come from Dakota and Lakota communities of South Dakota, including the 9 reservations located in the boundaries of the state. So when we did our initial assessment 2 years ago, we found that the largest single group of interviews came from the Rosebud Reservation of South Dakota. Our initial assessment found that this was to be about 150 or so interviews and recordings, though through the work of Maya and Gavin, they've discovered that it's more than twice that number, actually. So we did work with some other pilot projects and pilot communities that we're still in touch with, much smaller communities, but because of our connections to Rosebud, our project team members have, some of them have very direct connections to Lakota communities and Rosebud in particular, that we really felt like this would be the best way to go. So not quite a year ago, we hired Gavin Spotted Tail from Rosebud and Maya Red Horse from Cheyenne River Reservation as graduate students, and they have just done a ton of impressive work. I just honestly can't say enough about them. And they've really just completed their examination of the Rosebud Collection interviews. So they're going to tell you a little bit about that, and I think you'll find their presentation informative. And many of the things they found, both the good and the problematic, I suspect are illustrative of much of the other oral histories in the collection here at USD, but I'm very excited to introduce them to you. I know you'll enjoy their presentation. So Maya and Gavin, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. Hamdak yapi. Chante washte na pe choose api. Gavin Sparta macha na Changa Lakota hamacha. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Gavin Spartatel. I am Changa Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota, and I'm a graduate student on the oral history project team.
Iushkia Wanchiankapi, Maya Red Horse Amachiapi, Wakwa Washte, Olyanke Amataha. My name is Maya Red Horse, and Dr. Hurley said I'm from Cheyenne River, and I'm also a graduate student on the project. Okay, so our presentation is specifically about Rosebud because that was really the pilot project that me and Gavin helped with the most. Okay, so like initially, Dr. Hurley and the Oral History Center had noted that there were 162 interviews belonging to Rosebud, different communities in Rosebud, but after the work me and Gavin have done, we have identified 321 interviews. And some of the general themes are ceremonies, songs and music, the Indian Reorganization Act or the Wheeler-Howard Act, land and agriculture, boarding school, and the main interviewers, they primarily wanted access to songs and ceremonies. So kind of, we felt like feeding into the stereotype of just like Lakota spirituality in general. And then once researchers found someone that was willing to share with them, they continued to go with them again and again. So a lot of individuals have 10 plus interviews in the collection. So we found that to be really interesting. And what was unique too, like Dr. Hurley said, Rosebud does have a unique relationship with USD. So a lot of tribal chairmen from Rosebud were able to do multiple interviews across decades with the researchers from the collection. And our workflow, we each pulled physical files from the boxes, similar to the boxes that are behind Dr. Hurley now. And we entered information into the spreadsheet so we could edit that on Mookadoo, because when we joined the project, a lot of the interviews were already uploaded on Mookadoo. In total, there were 55 boxes. And what's in the files is just a biographic sheet of each interviewee in regards to education, economic status, and even blood quantum. There was a lot of issues with the audio that we ran into, just quality, the accessibility and the accuracy of the audio, because a lot of folks speak English and Lakota and mix it together. So previous graduate research assistants were not able to accurately transcribe that. And like Dr. Hurley said, Lakota language takes up a big chunk of a lot of the interviews. And even if the interview is conducted in English, a lot of Lakota language is used throughout the interview, which really makes the Lakota interviews in particular unique and really special. But it also causes a lot of issues for us on this side. What do we do with these? What does it look like to honor these in the right way? Because we don't have a standard orthography. Every community speaks the language in their own way, like a lot of other communities do. And then questions of, do we translate Lakota straight across the board? Just putting it from Lakota to Lakota or Lakota to English and vice versa. There's a lot of ongoing conversations about that work.
Okay, so yeah, so Maya and I worked very closely with the Oral History Center project team. So we felt that we wanted to make the project, since it was being uploaded onto Mookadoo, very Indigenous centric, so focusing on the communities and what they want. So we plan to work very closely with tribes. So we're reaching out to tribal leadership and trying to collaborate with them to share their these interviews with them. So so we know what's appropriate to share, and if there's any anything that they don't want to share. An example of an interview that we felt would be kind of like symbolic of this project would be Dwayne Hollow Hornbear's interview, AIRP 2170. And in this interview, he talks about his ancestor, Chief Hollow Hornbear, and his Chinupa. His pipe was taken a long time ago and put into a museum. And he talks about in that interview, which happened in the 1990s, the returning of that pipe, the repatriation of that pipe to his family. And just recently, Dwayne Hollow Hornbear was also able to receive his Chief Hollow Hornbear's war shirt from a museum from Germany. And we felt that it was just like kind of just like lined up right. It was so because we're trying to return his interview back to him in the tribe as well. So we kind of just felt that was symbolic. And then one of the main categories in Rosebud collection is Lakota music. So some examples, some Richard Fulbel, so he's from Rosebud, he's a Rosebud elder. He plays a lot of flute music in the collection. Noah Kilsensight, he offered a very unique form of traditional music. So he would play on the saxophone traditional songs like Sundance songs and other ceremonial songs. But he was also one of the contributors or the creators that has a lot of interviews of music in this collection, as well as Seth Bickrow and singers. So Noah Kilsensight is also part of this group that helped Dr. James Jurens with his dissertation for his doctorate degree, which takes up a big part of the first third of the Rosebud collection. And another unique part of our collection is the Lakota language. So we have, throughout the collection, we have interviews that interchangeably use English to Lakota back and forth, but there's also interviews that are entirely in Lakota. So like Peter Bordeaux, he speaks entirely Lakota. He's a Rosebud elder. William Schwagman, he doesn't speak a word of English. And we come, like Maya mentioned, we come across like issues of what should we do with that information, that those recordings, like do we translate them? If we translate them, well, orthography, because orthography is a big talking point lately with indigenous languages. And Rosebud, they've adopted their one of their elders' way of writing Lakota, Albert Whitehat. So we would have to collaborate very closely with Rosebud curation team to get this to make it appropriate to share.
And then just some miscellaneous points that we found with the audio quality, like I mentioned before. A lot of the interviews are 50, 60, 70 plus years old. So there are degraded audio quality, and some files are actually duplicates or they're merged. So sometimes they're playing backwards while the interview is playing forward in each headphone. So that's tough. And some are just missing. So me and Gavin have been trying to best navigate those, but still having enough information to present it on Mukuru, because ultimately everyone wants to see their relative represented in the collection, right? Like it's a big deal to be able to hear your relative's voice again. So we really want to do our best not to only honor the community, but individual interviews as well. So we've been running into that with physical copies of the interviews as well. No transcripts, or they're not very legible, or sometimes they're inaccurate, but those are things that our team is working on together to, like I said, to make those accessible for everyone, especially keeping in mind that elders are really going to want to access this information, and making it as easy and as seamless as we can for them. while also making sure that there is consent for the interviews to be released, and all those little nuances are really important that we keep in mind. That's our presentation.
Well, thank you, Gavin and Maya. Really appreciate it. And that is our presentation for today. I'll just I'll put up my email in the chat here for everyone. If anyone needs to get a hold of me or have any further questions about the collection. And with that, I will turn it over to the University of Utah.
Okay, thanks, Sam. All right, last presentation, guys. We can do this. It's been a really enlightening afternoon while I'm out here trying to share my screen. I'm going to waffle a little bit. So, hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Roper, and I'm one of the multimedia archivists at the J. Willard Marriott Library at the University of Utah. I'm joined by my colleague, Fallon Carey, our project archivist, for this presentation. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. I also want to introduce the rest of our team who aren't in this presentation, but Todd Samuelson is the Associate Dean of Special Collections and is the PI on this project. And Molly Steed has been working with us in multimedia as well. To begin, I'll provide an overview of our collection. We house approximately 1,465 interviews covering tribes in the Southwest, the Upper Colorado Plateau, and the Great Basin. These were collected between 1966 and 1972, though we have some material dating to earlier in the 1960s in the collection and related collections covering the 1970s and 80s. The Doris Duke American Indian Oral History Project was led by Dr. C. Gregory Crampton, the director and co-founder of the university's American West Center. Floyd O'Neill was the director of field operations, and a team of interviewers worked regionally to conduct 2,146 hours of interviews with over 990 Native and non-Native individuals. One of these interviewers was Dr. Gregory Thompson, our Associate Dean Emeritus for Special Collections, who is still involved in our work on this project. We have the original reel-to-reel audio tapes, which were digitized in 2005 to 2006 with an NEH grant, as well as the resulting digital audio files. And we have 66 boxes of our print transcripts and translations. 33 of these boxes include drafts and notes, and the other 33 contain final approved copies of the transcripts. At this point in the project, we have around 530 digital heritage items in the Mercatu platform.
As we progress in the project, reviewing and adding more interviews into Mukatu, more tribes are being added. As of last week, we have added about 4 more to the list, and it continues to grow as we review the audio. I'd like to also acknowledge that many of the tribes listed here are vague and without specific tribal group names. This is due to issues with original metadata, which we hope to remedy as more research is done into the interviewees' tribal backgrounds. We have identified a few potentials for sub-collections that we would like to highlight. These collections are also up for tribal review as we continue outreach to tribal groups and are not currently publicly accessible. A large portion of our collection contains interviews related to the 1974 Navajo Hopi land settlement. It is mentioned in approximately 175 media files, and most contain more than one interview and are not in English. Another is our collection of interviews related to the Navajo Code Talkers. Included in this sub-collection is a recording of the first reunion of Navajo Code Talkers banquet held at Window Rock, Arizona. Individual interviews with Code Talkers and interviews with family members related to Code Talkers. Additionally, we hold interviews with veterans from other conflicts such as Vietnam, in which we are currently tallying. Many of the subject matter in our collection broaches the subject of urban living, urbanization, and the BIA relocation project, which began in 1956. If you are unfamiliar with this project, its goal was to encourage, with incentives, voluntary movement from reservations to urban areas such as Denver, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, and Cleveland. Today, it is regarded as a failed attempt to uproot Indigenous people from their culture and homelands, where they would disappear through assimilation. Interviews in our collection contain Indigenous perspectives of those living primarily in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Denver, as well as a group of residents in San Francisco involved in the Native American Indian Center of San Francisco. I am currently in the process of reviewing these interviews and will expand the collection as needed. In contrast, I would also eventually like to create a sub-collection of interviews that detail the experiences of those living on tribal reservations. Another important sub-collection would contain interviews of those who have experienced the effects of termination, a controversial legislation that was enacted in the mid-1950s and divided the Northern Ute Indian tribe of the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in northern Utah based on blood quantum. We currently have roughly 15 known interviews that discuss this topic. The effects of termination still plague tribal groups to this day. Also related to Northern Ute, we have many interviews that recount interactions with Chief Ouray and Chipeta, who were Northern Ute, or what is now referred to the Uinta and Ouray Agency and Reservation. They were both respected leaders, and our collection of interviews is composed of people who knew them or family that had known them. Our next sub-collection topic, the American Indian Movement. This is the sub-collection that I am most unsure of in numbers, but I do know we have interviews that cover topics such as the occupation of Alcatraz and the Mount Rushmore occupation of 1970 that protested broken treaties with the Lakota or Great Sioux Nation. Finally, our recordings contain approximately 25 interviews with Indigenous students attending Fort Lewis College. Topics discussed in these interviews include experiences of first-generation college students, the students' experience with discrimination, their motivations for attending Fort Lewis College, plans for their future, Shalico Club, family life, among others. Additionally, these were primarily recorded by Floyd O'Neill and Greg Thompson. Greg Thompson is still involved with our project. I would like to briefly discuss the review process that has been implemented while working in our collection. We have spent time reassessing inventory of current holdings, audio and transcripts, and are working to build new finding aids based on those created in the past and information we are gathering today. We are also researching and listing gaps in metadata, which include issues such as incomplete tribal affiliation of some interviewees, misspelled names, missing dates, while also taking note of how some interviewees are connected. We have also created a review policy for harmful content within the collection that includes outdated terminology or racial slurs, and we have also flagged interviews that contain descriptions of traumatic events. As of today, all audio files associated with our collection are downloaded to Mukatu, save those that need editing due to poor quality or contain more than one interview and need separating. We are now in the process of reviewing these media files by listening to them individually and assigning the updated metadata based on criteria previously mentioned.
Our pilot community collaboration is with the Pueblo of Zuni, and we've had a wonderful experience working with Cordelia, Councilman Kukate, and their team. At this point, there are 389 digital heritage items in the Mercati platform, which include oral history interviews and recordings of storytellers telling stories in Zuni. The first focus for the tribal review process has been these stories. Many of the sessions were recorded over 3 or more reels and are in the Zuni language, so it is hard to tell the order the stories are in these digital recordings. Figuring out where one story ends and another begins has been a big part of the process, as well as continuing work with Zuni language revitalization and identifying words in the recordings. As our paper translations are digitized, these will be added to the platform to peruse in conjunction with the audio recordings. As Fallon mentioned in her review process, we have encountered issues with incorrect and inaccurate metadata. This is particularly true in cases where specific tribes represented in the audio recording are not included in the metadata or have an incomplete or vague description. In addition, there is harmful language and content throughout the collection, and we want to be mindful for those listening and encountering these stories. One challenge we have is who is responsible for reviewing the interviews in our collection with non-native peoples, where there is oftentimes harmful language or inaccurate descriptions of ceremonies. Our physical collection has some challenges as well. As mentioned in the overview, we have multiple copies for transcripts. We've been working to identify which copies are the finalized versions, which were approved by the interviewees to prioritize digitizing these to put into Mercatus. We do have digital audio for all of the tapes in our collection, but there are a number of missing audio tapes to begin with, which is frustrating. Historically, archives considered the transcript to be the master copy of an oral history, as opposed to the audio recording itself, which does not take into account oral traditions or 21st century focus on media. The tapes we do have are aging rapidly and becoming obsolete, so it is a relief to have the digitized audio available from 2005. We are navigating copyright concerns and ethical considerations around permissions. And although I won't get into the weeds with that in this presentation today, we do share concerns with our other repository peers and look forward to the panel's discussions and feedback in the web conference this week. Finally, rebuilding relationships with tribes is an exciting and enlightening experience, but it does not always fit into a specific timeline that this grant cycle expects, which has proven to be a challenge as many of us are very busy in our current positions. We do think it is essential to work on whatever timeline our collaborators need and are committed to continuing this work. As far as our next steps, our next focus is digitizing our 40,000 pages of paper transcripts and translations. We are working with our in-house digitization team to get this project moving as quickly as possible in the next few weeks. Fallon is continuing her review of the content and metadata for our audio recordings and will be ingesting the remaining audio files into Mercatus digital heritage items. She is working on research to further develop the metadata, which will eventually be incorporated into our finding aids and our digital library collections for the University of Utah as well. We also have the potential for utilizing automation or machine learning with our library IT team. They are interested in developing tools that can review and flag harmful language in transcripts based on a word bank that we provide. There is also a possibility for generating indexes or subject outlines for the oral histories, which would reduce the amount of time needed to review each individual item. Instead, we can go directly to the areas of interest by subject heading or flag harmful language and pass that information along to our community partners. Please do reach out with any questions, ideas, collaborations, anything you have. We would love to speak with you or help you do research with our collections. Thank you for your time and attention today. All right, that's us done. Thanks, everyone.
Wow. Well, thank you all. What incredible presentations and so many cross currents to think about. So thank you for that. Melissa and I are ready to, if they're to field any questions for all of these cohorts about what's going on. And so I welcome those in the chat room. If anybody has any questions for the last presentations. Okay.
You're welcome to raise your hand and speak up too, either way.
Well, while we're doing, is there one? Yes, there is a question. Yes.
So it looks like someone asked if there's any veterans collections.
Remember this morning, Kevin Gover made reference to the, I believe it's the Library of Congress. I hope I'm remembering this correctly. That's taken on the veterans projects as those oral histories as a repository. I think your question suggests how might we make that information more linked into this in some way. Maybe there's some way to think about that. And I also appreciated looking at other capturing of oral histories through Storycorps and others, and how we might all learn from those approaches and methodologies. Yeah. And
it looks like Tressa has her hand raised.
Great. Oh, Tressa, yes.
Hi there. Wow, this is amazing. Thank you all so much. I don't know if you can see me, but I did fidget around over here. Okay. Anyway, thank you all so much. Amazing day, very inspiring. My question right now for Rebecca, the reason I didn't write it is because I don't really have it formulated yet. I was kind of multitasking over here, and I heard her say something about an urban component of the archives. And I wanted to know more about that diaspora and how from the standpoint of the people that she's working with, how does that feed in, especially from the San Francisco Bay Area? And here's why. Because one of my mentors, Dr. Louis Chemnitzer, was part of what was then called the Urban Indian Project of San Francisco. It was funded by the National Health Institute. And in the 1990s, I revisited the project with Bill Willard, the late Bill Willard of American Indian Studies at Washington State University, Pullman, where our colleague Michael is chimed in from earlier. In any case, we were revisiting the data and the archives, and they both passed away. I inherited both of their archives, and I've been working with the American Philosophical Society, but I still have questions, and also am interested in other people who have questions about the relocation efforts especially in California, from other diasporic communities. And again, I wasn't able to tune fully in. So if Rebecca could speak to whether the archives they're working on in Utah have any interest in those kinds of questions, and or if they have a repository for these kinds of interview data.
Yeah, I might defer to Fallon or Greg if he's here and wants to talk for their expertise, since Fallon is the one actually reviewing the content of those tapes, and Greg was one of the interviewers at the time, but I'm not sure if they're still around.
All right, this is Greg. I'm here. I could just give you a brief overview. I think it's been a long time, and I'm not sure I remember all of it, but there was an effort to work with the students at San Francisco State University who were part of a sociology class and were kind of the first initiative out to Alcatraz via canoe, and headed by an Alaskan Native American who was very astute in canoeing. And
You have to be to get out there.
yeah, it's tricky, but
treacherous.
It was a common event for this individual. Anyway, we did do some interviewing with several members, I believe, of that group to try to pin down what was going there. And I believe there are some other interviews. The focus on the urban groups included California, included the Bay Area, and included Los Angeles. and it obviously included our own region in Utah and the Great Basin area. Catherine McKay, who is a professor at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, was one of the principal interviewers in that segment of the collection, along with Floyd O'Neill. And it's pretty diverse as a body of information. We actually, I worked more with the Ute Nations and with the Navajo Nation in the overview of interviewing, and the relocation project comes up quite often in those interviews as a portion of the experience. And in most cases, we were interviewing people who had returned to their native reservation. And so it's a little harder to wrap your hands around the urban part of this, but it was very, very important at the time. And it revealed some interesting components. One of the individuals who was interviewed at some length, actually two people, Stan Lyman was considered the most talented agent, superintendent for the BIA agency offices. He was located at the UNO reservation in eastern Utah in 1966, 67, 68. He was then moved to the Sioux reservation and was there about 6 months when Wounded Knee 2 broke out. His earlier part of his career was associated with the Chicago relocation project. And he actually was Quaker. It's an interesting take on it. And he was white. And his wife, June Lyman, taught on multiple Indian reservations in the K-12 initiatives for both on-site Indian schools and schools surrounding reservations where Indian students attended. In some cases, it was the only school available for Indian students. So there are some interesting tales there that coming at it from the position of whites, but with deep and long interaction. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question the way you want it, but I must say, and I was involved with all aspects of the Utah project, it was one of the most interesting that was undertaken.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a very comprehensive answer to a rather vague question that I had posed. So I appreciate it very much. Perhaps we can follow up. I'll put my email in the chat because the flip side of my question was also a potential offering, because I do have the materials of my late mentors that were involved with the Urban Indian Project. So, and I myself have done ethnography on stories of return, migration. So people who were part of the relocation in the San Francisco Bay Area that returned to their reservation communities. So, and their homelands. So I'll put my email in the chat, and thank you very much. And everyone, thank you.
John, I think we're going to let you wrap up, and
yes,
we'll all stay on as long as anybody has any questions or comments. We'll be here, so you don't have to leave. But John, do you want to do your wrap up?
Yes, I'll do a wrap up here. First of all, I want to thank everybody that presented today. What an incredibly attentive and incredibly strong group, such enthusiasm, such substance throughout the day, such sharing, and really genuine, like from the heart questions, and like moving all of us together in a really good way. So that's wonderful. Big thanks to Susan and Melissa for all of the work of setting this up. It's not an easy task. It's a lot of hard work, and I really appreciate everything you've done. I also, the thoughtful kickoff that we got from Sam Gill this morning gives us all a lot to sleep on tonight and think about as we prepare for tomorrow. And tomorrow brings a lot of interactive work and discussion on the key issues that we've articulated throughout the day. So everyone's homework assignment overnight is to be thinking about this in as deep a way as you can, and being prepared tomorrow to really have further hearty discussions to move this work forward. There's so many ideas that we could all follow up on: urban Indians, the veterans piece, the Storycorps piece, all of how this interaction. I saw that many tribes were mentioned in several of the universities of the same tribe, and so how that information is integrated with one another, and the institutional relationships that come out of this good work. We also have a chance to talk about funding and training and sustaining the Native Oral History Project, and also the technology. We really touched on a lot of the technology. Hearing tomorrow from two of our finest Native writers, Tim Tingle and Scott Momaday, will be a thrill. And also, we will hear about the legal issues. We've talked a lot throughout the day about protocols and the complications of the protocols and legal permissions and all of the rest of it. And I think that's something that we all have our eyes wide open on that. And also, we have such advocacy. I've worked with foundations throughout my career. I don't think I've ever seen anything as connected and supportive and directly engaged as we have from the staff of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And Ramali and her colleagues, Sam, and everyone else, they are really front and center on this work. They have been there to help us all move this forward. So with that, I bid everybody a really good evening and a welcome back tomorrow. We're going to have another wonderful day. So thank you again, Susan. It's been a wonderful experience today.
And again, we'll stay on, but do heed John's instructions to look at those questions that we'll be asking you tomorrow, because it's our opportunity to really envision the future and where we want to go with this project. And I echo your comments about the Doris Duke Foundation. They're amazing.
Amazing. Yeah.
And John, I also need to acknowledge you, because John is not only our master of ceremonies, he's also the reason this project exists. You're probably too modest to talk about how this started, but if you have a few minutes and can indulge us, it would be great to hear about your role in the genesis of this project.
You know, all I can say is it's almost 5 years to the day since I retired from NMAI, but once you're in the fold, you never retire. There's always something more to do with Native communities. And so I've been doing through work with ATOM and Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, seeing community inspiration projects, seeing what's happening at the community level. So it's a gift to me. And I really appreciate everything that I continue to learn through this process. And so when I talked early on with Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, they were figuring out what are we going to do on this? And I said, I guess the best thing I can say is that I was a cheerleader in the background saying, yes, let's do this. This is such important, and I commend you for all your good effort. And also building on philanthropic support that was decades ago. This is amazing that is coming to fruition in 2022 and moving forward. So that's thrilling. So let's keep it going.
Thank you. Again, we'll stay on the line. People who need to go, but we'll stay on the line as long as anybody's here to continue the discussion. Thanks again, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Melissa, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Any comments, anything?
No, just, everybody seemed to have a wonderful day, and the repository has made some connections with people in the chat, so that's good. And yeah.
And Tim, were you going to say something when I jumped in and interrupted you, for which I apologize? You're muted.
Yeah. I was going to suggest to the last lady who spoke, who was it?
Tressa.
Yeah, about, I was going to give her the name of Michael Hammond, who is very well informed on relocation and return of Native populations in San Diego and South and Southern California. I don't even have his email, but I was just going to share Michael Hammond. He's connected with San Diego State University and several Native communities, and he's very familiar with the relocation. I was going to share that. So she did in her email, so I can send that to her.
Is it the same Michael Hammond that was the director of the Agua Caliente Museum in Palm Springs?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We have his email address and we're happy to share it. So,
Yeah. That's all.
good. And I can see Greg Thompson still on. Greg, you're one of the, would you consider yourself to be a Dookie as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Were you on earlier?
I've been on, yeah. I finally figured out I wasn't showing up, so I hit the button. Yeah, Duke shaped my career in a major way, and it was quite an experience. I'd like to thank you and the group for putting on quite a day. This is something else.
It is. I don't know about you, but I'm emotionally exhausted.
Yeah.
Because it's just,
I am too, and I'm still pretty emotional about it. It means a lot, and I think there will be a considerable leveraging of the information created 50 plus years ago out of this initiative and everybody involved, and that's exciting.
isn't it? I don't think that when we started it, we ever realized the magnitude of it or the importance of it. And I'm humbled every day to think that we started this project with such confidence that we could get it done quickly. And now I know that is so wrong, and that we have to do it slowly, carefully, thoughtfully, and with great respect. And it's
and also quickly.
Yeah.
So much to do.
Well,
I would add to, somebody was asking about the veterans part at American West Center here on the campus, the University of Utah, and the Marriott Library. There is a very large World War II, Korean, Vietnam, and now Afghanistan collections that does include Native Americans, soldiers, both men and women, and a lot of that is showing up online and available. It's been a huge project here.
And also, Susan, regarding veterans, the new Choctaw Cultural Center is very much dedicated to veterans. There's even a film, a short black and white film on the Choctaw Code Talkers, because I've spoken about this before, that the Navajo Code Talkers are on almost everyone's minds, but World War I, the Choctaw Code Talkers are given credit by the French, much more. And anyway, so the new Choctaw Cultural Center, that would be a good access for information, stories regarding Choctaw veterans.
That's great.
It's important to understand the broader setting for code talking by Native Americans. It's really, it kind of blows your mind when you get in and dig around in the weeds a little bit with this topic.
Yeah.
Well, great. I know everybody's had a long day. Unless there's anything else, somehow I've lost my screen.
No, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So
okay. Good. Well, it's been a wonderful day. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
All right, see you tomorrow.
12
Thanks.
noon?
Yes, 12 noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern.
See you at noon.